I want to welcome you to our 15th annual Kernochan Center Symposium. My name is Pippa Lowengaard. I'm the executive director of the center, and it is a joy to have our first live symposium in 3 years. We are delighted to see you in person. We do have some panelists joining us on Zoom, and we are also thrilled that technology has allowed us to have people who otherwise couldn't be here join in the discussion. And we are very well represented. I think we have every continent represented in our speakers. So that's a pretty fantabulous end of the day story. So before we kick off, I want to go over some logistical issues. The bathrooms, normally the most important thing for those who are in the room, are you can go down the hall right in front of the doors, turn right, and they are just before the double doors that you will come to on that hallway. For those of you seeking CLE credit, we do hope you signed in. If you didn't, please take an opportunity at the first break to do so. And please take an evaluation sheet. I understand that they weren't always given out when CLE seekers did sign in, so please take one. There are some at the registration desk in front, and I've also brought some to the couch thing in the back of this room. And we do need that if you wish CLE credit. As you know, today we're going to discuss legal protections, regulations, and the future of press publishing. Not a small subject matter for 3.5 hours. The Copyright Office published a study on the issue in June, and America is but one of countries across the world grappling with the future of journalism. The EU's Article 15 of the Digital Single Market Directive was due to be implemented in June of 2021, but only a handful of countries have implemented it as of now. Australia has also passed legislation in 2021, and Canada and the US have seen legislative proposals in their respective governing bodies in the past year. Most of these materials, except the Australian law, are in the materials which you can download from the Kernochan Center website. Whether news aggregation is a problem at all, of course, is up for debate, and that is something our first panel will address in a moment. What solutions may be the harder topic, and panels 2 and 3 will try to grapple with determining correct legal or extra legal structures. So without further ado, I don't want to take up time from our substantive discussion. We're going to start with Lisa George, Emily Bell, and Colin Stretch on panel 1. I do want to make a note that bios are also available online, either through the QR code that you scanned when you came in, or on our Kernochan Center website. So I'm not going to do further introductions, and I don't think our other moderators will as well. So, Lisa?
Thank you. Very happy to be here. Really excited to interact with lawyers and law faculty and law students, which is something new for me. I'm an economist. I'm at Hunter College. I also have been teaching the media course at NYU. You can make a little note to talk to me at the break about a monthly seminar on the economics of media markets that I run in New York City. I would love to have some of you on the mailing list. So ask me about that at the break. So I'm going to kind of kick off this day with an intro to how economists are thinking about media markets. Skim the surface of some research and share some findings with you. So a little bit of demand, supply, competition, the big 3 words of economics. So first of all, from an economist perspective, the way I tend to think about media markets is consumers are it. We think about it from the consumer perspective, the reader perspective, the person who uses information, okay? And so value to people derives from reading or watching or interacting with content, okay? And we can measure and study this because this value is revealed to us, often in data or research settings. It's revealed to us through their behavior, through willingness to spend money in some markets and willingness to spend time. Time is scarce, and so we can study consumers this way.
Would you?
No,
they can't.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm sorry. So I'll stand by the. I'll try to stand by the microphone so I can read. So here's some things that we know about consumers, and I have some slides for that. So first of all, people have strong preferences for what you might call pro-attitudinal news. Okay? This predates the internet, probably predates television, although there's less research on that. So people like to consume media that meshes with their worldview. And this comes largely from trust, but also from just other psychological factors of kind of feeling comfortable with ideas. And this is true online and offline, but there's more attitudinal alignment of consumption online than offline. Okay? And in part, that's because there are just more sources available. Another important point is that consumption, what people read, what they look at, it does respond to what you might call feeds or search costs, what economists usually call search costs. If you deliver things up, if you make it easier for people to consume one thing versus another, behavior changes. Like 50 papers I could list off the top of my head that show that in some way. So people's behavior will change a lot when you make things easier or harder to access. But their beliefs, not so much. Okay? There's quite a bit of research just trying to ask the question, can media persuade? Okay? It's not there's not a clear answer to whether you can change people's beliefs and attitudes, even when you change their consumption. And that has good sides and bad sides because one, it makes it harder to persuade people, which you might, when you want to persuade, maybe that's hard, but it also means that people's beliefs are quite resistant to false information or what you might call fake news. Okay? So a couple of pictures, although Pippa told me not to call them pictures. That's like, she told me to call them graphs because she thinks there's a difference. So, a little bit of information. So there's strong evidence for demand for pro-attitudinal news, and that's related to trust. So trust in sources of information is important. You might have seen graphs like this before. This one is from the General Social Survey. It's long-run trends in trust in institutions, and the print's small, but the media is on the bottom line. Okay? And there's some thinking, so trust has changed. So the decline in trust in media over 30 years is not that big, but it's pronounced. There are pronounced differences across parties. So here the blue line is left-leaning Democrats, the red line is right-leaning. And so this is, there are all sources in my slides. I'm not going to tell you all the sources. But the Gallup polls plot that there's been a divergence in this trust. Okay? And so right here, you can see where some attitudes toward media come and consumption behavior. People prefer media that they trust. They prefer sources that they trust. And mass media has become trusted by some types of consumers than others. So a little bit of, there's some really cool and interesting research about what I like to call news slant. Some people will call bias, but it's really on the direction of news. And this is old research from newspapers. And I'm not going to explain this graph too much, but what it tells you is like on a scale of 0 to 1, with left-leaning, right-leaning, that the slant of news is aligned. So firms kind of deliver news suited to the population. Okay, so it shouldn't surprise most of you that the San Francisco Chronicle has more left-leaning kinds of content than the Tampa Tribune or the Houston Chronicle. Okay, so you can measure this in different ways, but in newspaper markets, going back, you can measure through various sources that there's an alignment between news outlets and individual views, or sort of the dominant political preference, that comes from firms trying to give consumers what they will buy or read. The piece that's not so obvious is that this affects consumption. So if you take a mismatched person, okay, or a geography, so if you find a more conservative set of people in San Francisco, they read the news less than someone who's aligned. And similarly, if you find a left-leaning person in Tampa or Houston, they read the news less. Okay, so that's what. So when people don't have what they want, they're not so inclined to switch outlets. They're more inclined to just remove themselves or tune out. So that's an important thing these are all like some lessons for regulation. So I mentioned earlier, pro-attitudinal news consumption is actually stronger online than offline in those newspapers that I just showed you, in part because of the abundance of sources. And so this picture or graph, the dotted line is all news, okay? And the sort of slant on a 0 to 1 scale, with 50% kind of being median, is so all news consumption is kind of closer to the center, but the tails of the blue, which is Facebook references, they're fatter tails. Okay, so that's sort of, there's more pro-attitudinal slant on conservative, consumed on social media. And I have the citations for these if you want to really read the pictures. But so this is another finding, that we have a lot of pro-attitudinal consumption. All right. So next big point is that consumption responds to what I call transaction costs or information costs. That's kind of an econ buzzword. But when you make it easier or harder for people to see certain types of content, their behavior changes. Might not always be a lot or a little. And this is from one of my papers. This is an old paper, and it's a kind of crummy looking graph. But basically, I looked at local news consumption right after Google introduced geotargeting. So there's a paper, Google News starts slapping content on the right-hand side of the page matched to where you live, right? And that small transaction shifts news consumption to local sources a little bit. I mean, the actual lesson of this paper is that these trends are statistically significant, but they're not especially economically significant. So this is also true with counter and pro-attitudinal news. The newest research in economics working in media runs some very interesting experiments, like NSF-funded large scientific projects. And so this study, which I like a lot, and again, it's a bit hard to interpret just right here on the dot, but if you know something about people's preferences when they sign up for a large scale, like, thousands of people kind of agreeing to have their feeds tracked, and you put some of them in a treatment group that sends them news or asks them to subscribe to news that matches their political preferences, and then another treatment is you ask them to sign up for something that goes kind of against their attitudinal treatment, you get more consumption of both things. Okay, so people do respond to in terms of consumption. So somebody who is a left-leaning person, when they have a treatment that gives them more right-leaning news, they consume more, and this is a treatment on Facebook, they consume more not just on Facebook. Their general news consumption changes. However, that same study, this is from a different study, is that this consumption across party lines, or this diverse consumption across lines, doesn't change beliefs and attitudes much. So in the online experiment study, they didn't have a good picture, so I didn't put it up there. But you get people in sort of a post-treatment survey 6 months and a year later, and their attitudes and beliefs have not changed from this news consumption. This is another paper on kind of Fox News and polarization, and it shows kind of on the supply side, this red versus blue is sort of Fox News versus MSNBC kind of measurement of polarizing or sort of party affiliated content. And so big trends in separation. So earlier on, there was a lot more overlap in the way they talked about stories. But again, when you measure this up with polarization, the effects are very, very small. Okay, and so beliefs, not so much. This persistence of beliefs, right? It's hard to change people's minds. It's both good and bad, okay? That people's beliefs come from outside of media and they don't budge very much. So this is kind of back to the experimental study on fake news. And you ask people about like their recall and the sort of the impact of fake news. And even a month after the election, you ask people about their recall of various true and fake news stories, and it's very weak. And in fact, the interesting thing in this study, I don't want to, is the fake and the placebo. You can ask people about real fake news stories that actually circulated, or you can make them up. Okay, and the fake news stories are remembered just as much as the real fake news story. And so again, this is part of the beliefs don't judge. A lesson from this paper is that the consequences of massive supply or modest supply, however you look at it, of false news has very little like actual impact on memory, recall, not even behavior. So anyway. So to the subject of the day of aggregators, and so I guess Pippa invited me because there's not that much research on aggregators, and I have a couple of papers on this. 3 quick perspectives, right? So the one that I think gets the most press, aggregators as pirates. I want to talk about sort of some more nuanced views as well as curators and as competitors. So the traditional view, the IP view, is that we worry about aggregation because of the incentives for supply. Okay, that if you in the counterfeit world, if you copy a product, it will diminish the returns to new content creation. From the econ standpoint of what delivers value to people, that's the big number one that's traditionally out there. But the context in which we worried about that is changing. Okay, and so the framework and assumptions for that approach is that content is costly to create, but finding it and putting it together and getting the stuff that you like is easy or trivial. Okay, so that's the background for that. We protect intellectual property and we have rewards to it in order to incentivize more, but that's in a world where content is expensive and search and bundling is cheap, and it's also where the value is in the content itself and not in the context. So 2 important kind of assumptions that go along with this framework. I don't know why the title's not there. I'm going to talk about some evidence at the end, but there's kind of some evidence that this substitutability is actually not very strong. That there's more of a complementarity. Okay, there. That the complementarity of you post some kind of news and it drives more consumption of news outlets is bigger than the substitutability. But sort of the other kind of theoretical side, I put curators here. You could think of it as editors. Sometimes in econ, we just call it bundlers because there's a theory behind that. But in the world of the internet, it's hard to find stuff. It's hard to get stuff that's matched. And the more supply that's out there, the bigger the value added from institutions that can give you what you want. And remember, we've got this background of people have certain things that we know they like. And so the value in this curation is a really important source of value for this institution. And it's hard, it's something that's a different framework. It's a world where there's a lot of content online and it's very cheap to produce. So content is abundant, it's cheap, but the matching it to your tastes and verifying its truth. I mean, this is sort of an important, like media brands have that, but those are the costly things. Those are the costly things. And so again, evidence coming in a minute. So then the last piece, and this is a little less fleshed out, but one of the reasons that we're here, so aggregation has increased competition in media markets. Okay, one of the first order effects. It puts the New York Times in competition with the Washington Post and with the LA Times in ways that didn't happen before. It also puts news outlets in competition with government sources or expert sources. Okay, and if you think back to slide number 1, some of those lines like science and medicine, they're way above the media line. And so the internet allows you to access information from those more trusted sources that are above the line of media. And so this is an important aspect that no firm likes competition because competition drives down profits. Okay? But on the consumer side, and my focus, the piece that we I think I would urge you to kind of keep in mind, is that this part is unequivocally good for consumers. So this aspect that you have choices. I mean, the internet has just fundamentally changed the kinds of information I can access in my world, and I'm like eternally grateful for, these different scholarly communities that we've connected through. And so, but this aspect of competition is partially why we're here, because it reduces profits, it drives down profits, and there's and this impact is something to discuss. So we could have a whole other conversation about how funding models affect content. Okay, so this is another research area that's interesting. We don't have time to talk about it today, but when you change funding models, this is one of the consequences you have to think about. So how does it affect consumers? How does it affect what firms produce? Okay, so advertising has generally been a source push for centrism. Advertisers don't like controversy, they don't like drama. And so advertiser-funded media has tended to push toward centrism. And the more you move toward delivering things that subscribers want and they want to share, there's a pressure toward sensationalism. So these are all possible unintended consequences. So some papers in my last minute, some local news online. This is my paper. You deliver some locally targeted content, you change behavior. A new paper that somebody wrote that's kind of a spin-off of mine, the same local news geo-targeting affects searches for SEC securities information. Okay, so again, like what you deliver affects behavior. This is a Susan Athey paper on Spain. Take away Google News in Spain. News consumption among consumers drops 20%. Okay, like big effects, okay? And then the last one, these are not in chronological order. The taking links off of a site, so occasionally have pulled links off of websites for exogenous or contractual reasons, diminishes visits to outlets. All right, so just to wrap up, as you think about interventions in these markets, I encourage this focus, again, first and foremost, on consumers, okay? And consumers as their own internal valuation of information, not exactly what you think people should read, but what people choose. And people respond to small changes in price, and they respond to small changes in search costs. So any intervention can have potentially very large impacts on consumer behavior. I don't think people expected the Spanish intervention to reduce news consumption by 20%. It means really quite a lot. And consumers see many substitutes for published news. So interventions that raise the time or money costs of accessing published content will lead to switching. There are many substitutes from experts, from government sources, and from friends or junk. So there's good substitutes and there's bad substitutes, but there are substitutes. So funding models affect the incentives for coverage of firms. So when you change funding models, it doesn't just change the money that comes in the door, it changes the kind of content that delivers that money. And those are some cautions on that. And then some other like unintended consequences, lower quality, higher prices via content. These are all possible things. So I know I'm out of time, so I will stop there. Ask me at the break about my seminar if you would like to come and any other things. And I will turn it over to whoever's next.
That would be Ellen, thank you. Can we just turn off the slides?
Thank you, Pippa. And thank you to the Kernochan Center for inviting me here to participate, particularly Professor Ginsberg. I'm grateful to be here in such distinguished company. My name is Colin Stretch. Pippa mentioned that bios are available. Just as a preview, I worked at Facebook for about 10 years. Lisa's here because she's an economist. I believe I'm here because I can share the industry perspective on some of these issues. I will say I no longer speak for the company. I left there about 3 years ago. So you can blame me for what I say, but not necessarily the company. So is online news aggregation a problem? That's our question for this panel. And at first glance, the answer is clearly yes. The traditional news business has declined precipitously in the last several decades. In the year 2000, US newspapers reached more than 55 million households every single day. In 2020, they reached fewer than half that number. The loss in audience matches a sharp revenue drop. News publisher revenue declined over 50% during the same period. And employment, critically, in the news sector shrunk as revenue disappeared. 57% fewer reporters, editors, photographers worked in the industry in 2020 than in 2004. Online news aggregators, by contrast, are doing pretty well. These entities, for all practical purposes, didn't exist in 2000. The majority of Americans now say they consume news from them. They point to social media sites, they point to news aggregators such as Google News, and the revenues of these companies has skyrocketed. Facebook and Google together make more than $200 billion in annual ad revenue, which is an order of magnitude more than the entire news industry did at its zenith. And we're just getting started. Newspaper and magazine publishers are projected to lose another $15 billion in combined revenue through 2026, and digital advertising revenues are projected to climb to nearly $750 billion in the same period. And these changes mirror what we've seen with our own eyes in terms of where we all get our news. Since 2004, close to 2,000 US newspapers have shut down. More than 3 million people no longer have a local newspaper. And that's to say nothing of the decline in resources dedicated to covering local news by those newspapers that remain. We all, or at least many of us, I'm looking at the age range in this audience, grew up on local news. The local paper was a valuable source of community information, a venue for reconciling opposing perspectives, and for me at least, most importantly, a mechanism to drive transparency and accountability in the institutions that directly affected our daily lives. In many, if not most communities in this country, that's no longer the case. And that's not the only casualty here. Alongside these trends, we are witnessing worrisome trends in trust in the news, as Lisa pointed out, as well as cause for concern in media literacy. There is, in short, a problem. But is online news aggregation the problem? These trends were in motion long before many of us had even heard of Facebook and Twitter, and well before Google News was a thing. Some of you may, like me, be old enough to recall Tom Cruise's infamous couch jump on Oprah Winfrey's talk show in 2005. Instead of the interview being about his upcoming film, the highlight was Cruise jumping on the couch and gushing about his then-girlfriend, Katie Holmes. The celebrity meme went viral, first on YouTube, then on internet gossip blogs, and it savaged the carefully manicured public image that Cruise's PR team had developed through traditional media. Or if you're a sports fan like I am, you may recall when Buzz Bissinger, he of Friday Night Lights fame, dressed down Will Leach, the founder of Deadspin, which was an irreverent and often crass sports blog. Bissinger thought he was standing up for quality sports journalism. What the episode actually underscored was that the internet had enabled a new style of content to find an audience, and it was coming at the expense of the old guard. So these incidents, again, long before we were talking about news aggregation, had everything to do with technological disruption of traditional news media, and nothing to do with online news aggregation. The culprit was simply the internet. And it wasn't just Tom Cruise's PR team or Buzz Bissinger's lock on sports commentary that was being disrupted, it was the entire industry. So this is rote by now, but it bears repeating. News publishers historically operated local monopolies. They hired journalists who wrote stories that attracted readers whose attention could be sold to advertisers who would pay for real estate in that newspaper. And the distribution infrastructure necessary to operate this business, from the printing presses that printed the paper, the labor forces that operated them, and the paper boys that delivered them, was expensive. And once in place, it operated as a formidable barrier to entry. And as a result, for most of the 20th century, news publishers faced limited competition, attracted reliable audiences, and delivered reliable returns to advertisers and in turn to investors. The internet, of course, disrupted this business by setting distribution costs essentially to zero, The infrastructure that publishers had built to deliver content became obsolete almost overnight. Anyone with a connection to the internet could publish, and anyone browsing the internet was a potential customer. And as Lisa has written, the decrease in distribution costs meant that newspapers no longer enjoyed local monopolies. Deadspin could compete head-to-head with Sports Illustrated, and if people liked Deadspin better, it would win. All of the trends we talk about when we talk about the decline in news derive from that simple fact. The barriers to entry to delivering content disappeared, and the industry experienced massive upheaval. That upheaval has costs, but it has fueled real innovation. For all the talk about the challenges facing traditional journalism, and there are many, as consumers, we are experiencing something of a golden age. Whatever your interest, tech news, sports, wine, law, I don't pick those four by accident. You can choose from free and paid newsletters, ad-based online publications, subscription publications, and of course, an endless number of podcasts. Through the magic of the internet, all of these media have an opportunity to reach anyone, anywhere, and consumers have choices that were unimaginable 2 decades ago. It's the internet that's the problem, although, granted, one that has a lot of upside. But then where do online news aggregators fit in? They're not the same. From where I sit, online news aggregation is clearly part of the upside. Lisa made the important point that curation of all of this content is hard, and there's real value in it. And online news aggregation is a tool that helps with curation. Anyone producing news, newsletters, subscription, ad-based publication, podcasts, can use any of the online tools they have available to them, including news aggregation, to find and grow their audience. But they don't have to. Where it's not the case, where it doesn't provide value, they can simply decline to use them. No one is required to establish a page on Facebook and post links to articles. No one is required to be indexed by Google and appear in Google News. And no one has any obligation to establish a Twitter presence. News producers do that today because they get value from them. A newsletter publisher may find new subscribers via Twitter. An ad-supported news publication may derive traffic from Google, and that translates directly into revenue. That's a choice news publishers make every day. If it doesn't make sense for them, and for many it doesn't, they can simply make a different choice. So to return to the question posed to the panel, far from being the problem, online news aggregation is a solution, or a part of a solution, to the challenges posed by technology. It's a mechanism by which journalists and their employers, those who are seeking to survive and thrive in a very different environment technologically than existed 2 decades ago, can find and grow their audience. I want to close with 2 additional points, and then I'll wrap, and we'll look forward to your questions later. So first, why does it matter? Why do these definitional questions really matter? Who cares whether we label the internet the problem or online news aggregation enabled by the internet the problem? Well, the rest of this morning's symposium is directed at various policy proposals for addressing the challenges faced by the news industry. Sound policy requires a clear-eyed understanding of the nature of the problem we're trying to solve. My own view is that hasn't been the case in this area. As early as 2015, Spain enacted a link tax that forced Google to pay for linking to news publishers, notwithstanding that it was the publishers more than Google that derived value from the links. Google responded rationally by turning off Google News in the country, which made everyone, news publishers, Google itself, and especially consumers, worse off. More recently, Australia put in place a media bargaining code that allowed publishers to share links on Facebook and then demand payment from Facebook for the pleasure, leading Facebook to make the much criticized decision to prohibit sharing of news links on its service, at least for a time. Whatever you think of how Facebook implemented that step, it's difficult to argue with the logic of its position, or that the code had made all parties, everyone, especially consumers, worse off. One worry I have is that the current policy proposals now under consideration, some of which will be discussed later today, likewise just fundamentally misunderstand the value exchange in news aggregation. Who's getting value from online news aggregators and why? And if they do misunderstand that core question of value exchange, they'll likewise be counterproductive. The second point that I'll just mention in closing is the possibility, some would argue the certainty, that when it comes to technological disruption to traditional news media, the internet was a thing, but we're just getting started. We've read much recently about artificial intelligence, about AI-powered language and image generation models. The progress here is astonishing, and it's accelerating. It's a matter of years, not decades, until these AI models generate well-written, accurate content with minimal human involvement. Image and soon video generation models likewise will render the content generation component of a number of industries, news among them, cheaper, faster, and far less reliant on human capital. That's happening. And when it happens, as it happens, it will set the cost of content generation near zero and again disrupt the economics of the news. When, not if, but when that happens, we'd be well served to accurately identify the actual technological trends that are driving that disruption and to formulate our policy responses accordingly. Thank you.
Emily, do you want to stay here?
If possible, because my legal education stopped at undergraduate, which is where you take your law degrees in the UK. So being in a law school, I think I've been in this one maybe 3 times in a dozen years, is both aspirational but highly triggering. So I'm just going to remain seated, but I want to thank Professor Ginsberg and congratulate the law school on having 15 years of this very important symposium. My background is I'm a journalist. I work for The Guardian in the UK for 20 years. I spent 10 of those as an editor and reporter working on technology and media issues from a business angle. Because I was covering a period where we had what we thought was convergence, though in fact real convergence probably happened about a decade later, I was unfortunately the shovels and show business correspondent who covered things like cable news and therefore the birth of the internet, fiber cables going into the curb, changing the way that communication was conducted. And then I spent 10 years as the editor-in-chief of The Guardian's websites, and it was a period where we took The Guardian from being the 7th largest newspaper in the UK to one of the top 3 English language news sites in the world. So I would echo what Colin said about the opportunities and upsides of the internet, which is not a future we could have possibly imagined from the position that we held before. Now I run something called the Tower Centre for Digital Journalism over at the Journalism School. And when I was hired to do that by Dean Nick Lemon, it was with the idea of assessing the impact of technology on journalism. And when I arrived, I think it's fair to say that the key problem that journalism had was one of economic sustainability. How could we possibly find a business model that will work and support journalism? 12 years later, I would say we have a very different crisis on our hands. Yes, economic sustainability is still a problem for smaller players, particularly in the local market. We can come back to that. It's not a problem for the New York Times. It's not a problem for Fox News. It's not a problem for CNN. It's not even actually a problem for The Guardian, when many people thought it would be. Because economies of scale have actually served those businesses really well. Online subscriptions have really helped power larger news organizations to be able to corral more and more and more assets behind paywalls. The problem that we have at the moment is twofold. It's one of freedom of the press and actually the ability to even do your job as a journalist in what's an incredibly noisy and hostile environment. One of the courses I teach at the moment is called Information Warfare Reporting, which we started with a rather splashy title 5 years ago, thinking we weren't quite sure who was going to take it and how we would teach it. And if you'd asked me at the time to produce a threat pyramid of who is at the top of the threat pyramid when we're talking about reporting in a hostile information environment, I would have said it would be probably a conflict reporter, maybe somebody who was working in physically hostile environments, maybe somebody who's reporting in Ukraine right now. I would not have necessarily thought it would be somebody who is reporting on the Board of Education in their local town. And yet those students now need security and training in hostile online attacks just as much as anybody operating in a different type of environment. And the second one is just the basic erosion of democracy. We are, depending on who you listen to, 2 elections away from a real crisis in Western democracy. The Brazilian rerun between Bolsonaro and Lula, and the US midterms. In both of those elections, we have the potential for parties to come to power who have an express intent to stack state houses and justices in a way that says, if you don't like the outcome of a federal election, you can overwrite it. So that's the crisis that the press now finds itself in, and it's the crisis that we're all in. To Colin and Lisa's points, many of which I agree with, incidentally, but I feel that they sort of sit slightly outside the real issue about what is the problem with online news aggregators. The problem with online news aggregators is that they are a small part of this much larger problem of a highly disrupted information commons. So, very simple question you can ask is, why am I seeing this? Who put it in front of me? And who paid for it? So that's, I think, something that we could define from, if you like, the analog system of news. It wasn't always completely easy, but you knew who was the advertiser, you knew who was the journalist, you knew who was the publisher. You could generally visit the offices of your local newspaper if you wanted to. You had some sense of why you were seeing something. It might be on the newsstand, it might have come through your front door in the morning, it might be on the TV news in the evening. I would defy you now to actually look with any depth at the messages that you get across your phone screen, pretending to be news on a daily basis. I would defy you to say, where does it come from, who sent it to me, and why am I seeing it? I'll give a very small example of something that happened a couple of weeks ago, which is Facebook announced that they had, in concert with a research unit, identified propaganda networks in Ukraine. And what the networks had been doing was spoofing the design and sometimes the bylines of journalists in legitimate organisations. And one of those organisations is The Guardian, which I worked for a very long time. A declaration of interest. I sit on the board of The Guardian now. I'm still very involved in it as an organisation. So a question that you might ask about these thousands of stories that were distributed in Ukraine under the title of different news organisations, none of whom had produced it, which is, how many people saw those pieces? What did they say? How long did they circulate for before they were taken down? Is it possible to retarget those people who saw those articles, explaining to them that they didn't actually read an article in The Guardian? The answer to that is we don't know. There is one organisation that does know, and that's Facebook. But nobody else, the publishers don't know. Publishers that had no insight into how their material was being used on that platform. So one of the things that we have, which is, if you like, where is there a problem with news aggregators, is simply the illegibility of the whole system of how we consume and circulate news. And what you might not know if you haven't worked in a news organisation is that when somebody reads your material, whether it's through a Google search or whether it's on Facebook or whether it's scrolling on TikTok, which is increasingly sort of the way that one demographic gets their news, all of that data about behaviour belongs to the platform, which, quite right, the platform has created the environment for the publishing. The publishers decide to use the environment. The first-party data belongs to the platform. But it means that we're locked away from incredibly important insights about how are publics forming their views? How are these consumption patterns that Lisa talked about really evolving in real time at the moment? I was talking to somebody who had knowledge of, for instance, Google, who had worked as an engineer within Google News. And I was asking them some questions about the hierarchy. So, for instance, one thing you might not know is that you or I could create a page today. We could put it up on Facebook, and we could call ourselves a news media company. And there's no, it is self-certification. There is no standard or threshold for that. It's simply a taxonomy that the platforms have created, which you just elect to be part of. Similarly, in Google, you have articles and publishers which are labelled as news publishers and that are included in Google News. A couple of things, one of which is we conducted a research experiment with a network of what you might call sort of fake newspapers. We call them a pink slime network, which is a highly partisan network of supposedly local newspapers, which are actually set up to launder political funding, so that they're funded by PACs. They also act sometimes as crisis management PR newspapers, and they target very specific populations. So they might target in, for instance, counties in swing states, or they might target on abortion or something like that. And it's very hard to know if you don't actually have computational training where these things are coming from, or even who owns them. We've spent years with highly trained computational researchers trying to get to the bottom of how these things are circulated. Some of them showed up in Google News. So we said to Google, it's not clear to us why some of these are indexed as news and some aren't. And they said, well, we can't really tell you. Asking my engineer friend, what can we learn more about taxonomy, etc.? He said, well, you know, it's complicated. It's very difficult. It's not something that you can necessarily just sort of tell anybody. And it's also, you know, our business model. He also then said, by the way, I don't know why you're worrying about Google News. You know those stories you see under your search bar? I'm sure when you open your phone, you get a list of suggested stories underneath the search bar on your front page of your Google, the Google reading matter. And when Lisa talks about TV, press, etc., increasingly people, when you ask them where they saw something, they say, well, I found it on my phone. It was just pushed to me. That mechanism is 14 or 15 times more powerful than, for instance, Google News. And yet the company itself said, well, we can't really tell you anything about that because it's so highly personalized. We don't really have any idea of who is being shown what, when, and how. So do we have a problem? I think we do. I think we do have a problem when we can't afford to pay local journalists doing good accountability work. We have a problem when we have propagandists and political actors posing as legitimate news outlets. We have a problem when we have populations who really do have difficulty in knowing whether what they're seeing is real or not. And we have a problem when we can't access any of the real insight around that data to start to build a picture of what kind of world we're now living in terms of news and information. That's it.
Thank you. So before, I might have just turned this off. Before we get to audience questions, I want to see if any of you have comments on your co-panelists' presentations, and then I have a one question.
Could I just challenge the statement that the news aggregators have increased competition in news? Because I think they haven't actually. I think they've increased competition in content, but I'm not sure that they've actually increased competition in terms of what we would call reported news. So you have fewer, larger, richer companies. You actually have a sort of, so that was one thing I wanted to challenge.
So there's definitely a lot of stuff in a small amount of time, but technology kind of has sort of opposing forces. So when you put the New York Times and the Washington Post and CNN all like on a page, so the New York Times didn't compete in your face with as many outlets, or more like the Philadelphia Inquirer is now competing with other city papers. So one of my first published papers was a paper about the spread of the New York Times in the 90s via printing in local sites and introducing home delivery. And I showed that I showed how it affected sales of the LA Times and the Seattle Post-Intelligencer and those papers, but also how it shifted content, how the outlets moved their content away from things that they were competing directly with the New York Times and became more local. So the internet magnified that by putting these sites in competition with each other. And that's what I mean by this. But there is this superstar market in music, in television, where all of a sudden, if you're going to read one article about the Obama healthcare reform, you're going to gravitate toward the best ones and the ones that have the most readership. And so in that sense, news markets are not that different than music or television, where there's a bigger share at the very top, which is usually quality related. We don't always agree with with what that quality is.
No, but it's not. So
but it's
never.
it's
No,
share at the top
actually, it's
and a long tail.
Actually, it's never quality related, because tabloids have always outsold
So,
broadsheets by.
Economist version, consumer sovereignty, if people view it. So this is a place where we'll disagree. That
Journalists,
quality-
citizen sovereignty, I think matters more than consumer
but
sovereignty.
this is a very important distinction.
Yeah.
Do we take quality as what a user says, I like this piece rather than that? And am I going to, do I like this, or do I take a government source versus a local news source? I'm working on a paper now, which is how local government information competes with local news. And paradoxically, if you trust your local government, you're happy to go just read what happened at your school board meeting from their page. And so this works against news markets. So there's a lot of competition on the internet in different ways. I had one for you, too.
Okay, good.
No.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
So this the paid content, the distinction between ads and paid content and news is a very interesting one, and who pays for what. And the presence of plenty of paid content at very high-end news outlets has been an interesting, it's not a trend that I would have predicted. And so the more junk there is out there, the higher the value of these legacy brands. Like, if there's a lot of junk and you don't know anything else, it's like, I've heard of the Philadelphia Inquirer. I live in Philadelphia. So there's this interesting relationship between, as junk increases, the salience of the brand helps people find them. But now you have the same problem that this introduction in Rolling Stone and the New York Times of paid content. So I wanted your views on that. And
yeah, I think that's really. I mean, I think that part of this collapse in definition is really critical. I'm not a fan of sponsored content and the blurring of the lines between what is, a reported article versus what is a paid-for article. It's an inevitable outcome of the way that the model works on the internet. So that it is what it is. I mean, what really worries me is just that we had a symposium of advertisers and news publishers a while back that we held with Harvard's business school. And somebody from an advertising agency made a throwaway comment which has haunted me every single day since they said it, and that was in 2017, so we're now 5 years on from that. And she said, in the future, every free message, there's a good chance that every free message will be overwritten or underwritten commercially. Oh. And that if you want something which isn't overwritten or underwritten commercially, then you have to pay for it. And said it in a sort of a... Now, I would like to think that that was not actually going to happen, but it has happened in a way. So the number of sources now, I mean, the growth in non-profit news is one answer to that, which is, can you now afford, or are you going to think about a kind of a public media system which really puts news that people really need to read in front of them, whether they can pay for it or not? Because what you have at the moment is high quality content going behind paywalls, because you can't find it anywhere else. And then you have content which people want to pay to put in front of you circulating more widely. And the more you pay for it, the wider it will circulate. So the way that Facebook works, and the way that actually all social platforms work, is that you can make an article is an ad. I mean, it takes my favorite class for my students is when we buy ads on Facebook. Sorry, Colin, this is like, you know, nightmare come true. Because actually until you do it, you don't really realise the fact that there isn't really such a thing as an ad on Facebook. There is a piece of targeted content, and it can look like anything. It can look like the article that you published this morning. It can look like...
Although if you pay for it, it'll be designated as sponsored.
It's designated as sponsored or promoted, or it has a different... They have different designations on. The designation, if you're my age with my eyesight, is not always immediately apparent, but it circulates to you as an article in The Guardian. I could actually pay to have an article from the Wall Street Journal targeted to people for nothing. I mean, so not for nothing, I'd have to pay for that, targeted to people. And the Wall Street Journal would not know that I had paid and targeted their article to, and we see that actually quite often. It's sort of, so that collapse in what is paid, what is free, is it going to increase the value of companies with high quality content? Yes. Is it going to improve democracy? No, I think. And you know, we're in a position where we have to rethink all of this. I don't think it is just news aggregators. We have to rethink all of this because I think that some of those paradigms have just gone completely. That's my, if that makes sense.
So yeah, I just have one. I have to follow up on Lisa, and I'm interested in Colin's take on this too. The idea that what we hold paramount is consumer preference. Who has the responsibility? And the answer could be no one, but who has the responsibility to ensure that there isn't hate speech, and you can then delineate hate speech, and false news, and inflammatory news on the internet? Anyone? Or if people really want to hear hate speech all the time, should that be what we allow?
So first, the first order effect of seeing what people want and choose is, like, you just at some level have to say it means in a democracy that people vote with their feet, with their actions, their time, their money, their eyes. And we look at what people consume, and we are focused on this. It's true, you can focus on this like kind of negative extreme, but by and large, this is how people will spend their time, and they will choose that. And we can have preferences over what other people consume, but it's not so easy to change that with supply. You can put more supply out there, doesn't change what people choose. And so, like, yes, around the edges, we worry. News media have heavy moderation, very limits on what you can post on a New York Times comment page or a newspaper comment page. And one way that internet platforms compete with media is to have this open site, and it's very subject to manipulation, But the costs of shutting it down might be higher than the benefit. And so that's, I would say, every intervention in a market has maybe your intended consequences and your unintended consequences. So of course, you can shut down all commentary on all news, but would we be better? I don't know. So I'm just saying that like, we measure value by people's consumption.
Can I challenge?
Oh, okay.
Sorry, yes.
That was not a good answer. I don't know. I like that.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Thank you so much, panel. Thank you so much, distinguished panel members. Ms. George, I just based what you were saying that. Want to introduce yourself? Oh, I'm just here as I'm a graduate student at an unnamed university in the psychology program, and I'm actually writing a paper on conspiracy theory right now. But
Great topic.
Thank you so much, and quite apropos, I think. But is it consumer democracy or consumer sovereignty until we no longer have democracy? And I would just say that that going to Ms. Bell and what she was saying about taxonomy, I'm so Pippa, and I'm so sorry, I don't have your last name.
That's fine.
Okay,
That's fine.
Pippa's all right. What you were saying is that your question, it begs the question of whether this sort of speech can be suppressed, as if that's an option any longer, because you've got at least 6 platforms out there, Parler, Gab, Ritter, and True Social, that are almost entirely created for people who have been deplatformed off Twitter, Facebook, and the other large social media sites. So, and what's happening, though, is that you have, including the most prominent member of True Social, the former president of the United States, will post something and will only get maybe 8,000, likes or reposts on True Social, but people are screenshotting it and then retweeting it, and then also putting it on Facebook, and then those views go up into the millions. So it's almost like what Stuart Palmer, who founded the Whole Earth Catalog 60 years ago, said, information wants to be free, but have we reached the point where it's really more appropriate to say misinformation wants to be free?
I mean, so misinformation. I mean, and I think this is where it's really interesting to look at follow the money. So Truth Social is used by almost nobody. You're absolutely right. Even MAGA Republicans do not use Truth Social. But yeah, no, sure. So then the question is, who chooses that? Now, are we thinking about choice? I go back to my point about illegibility and just the fact that, when you start to study patterns of how individual messages or tweets are promoted, you nearly always find a coordinated effort behind them. There's very little that is organic in terms of how these things spread. And it's an interaction between Fox News and Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and TikTok and everything else in that universe. It's a kind of, it's very difficult, I think, there are several studies that say there is a social media and there is a mainstream media, and we need to try and apportion blame and regulation kind of between those two. So if you've ever worked in a newsroom, that is not how it works, which is Fox News almost certainly is commissioned at some level by Twitter. That this is a sort of, James Carey, a great communication scholar, would say, there's transmission and there's also sort of ritual and spread and discussion around news. And the spread and discussion around news is now kind of bigger than almost than the individual sort of fact, that Donald Trump tweets something. Then how it spreads is really, in real time, is very difficult to track. Does misinformation want to be free? It certainly wants to be sponsored by people who have a vested interest in it being, in it circulating. And it's run into very little resistance because we hadn't planned for that. I was talking to a fact checker the other day who said, my life changed when they put the share button on the mobile product of Facebook. Because until that point, we had a kind of an incoming of manageable things that weren't true in politics. And one design change, she said, I can't prove this, but one design change seemed to really sort of power a very different type of behavior. And the designers at Facebook would have every reason to think that that share button would be used in a very responsible, wouldn't be a threat to democracy. But this is the world we live in, where I think we just don't know. We're living in a massive experiment. We just simply don't know enough about the environment in which we're living.
We have one question from Bomity. Do you have a question? And then we have a remote question, and then I think we have to wrap up.
So, I'm just a simple IP gal. I think truth and democracy are too much for me to handle. But thank you, panelists, and awesome questions, awesome conundrums that you've raised. But I want to bring it back to Colin's points for a moment, maybe with the research as well. It seems to me that the business model of news aggregators is a concern. We spent some time talking about the amount of investment that traditional media made into creating these very expensive models of news gathering and of education, and even the amount of work and money that they put into building their reputations, right? So I read The Guardian, I read everything right in the morning, and then I get really impressed. But
So they don't have the data.
I was going to say we don't have enough data. It's like, therefore,
Colin, this reminds me of, and you interestingly brought up AI. It's the same arguments that I keep hearing. It's data scraping, it's content scraping. You know, it's all out there, right? This stuff is all out there. But really what you're doing is you're phoning up on other people's IP. You're phoning up on other people's business models. You're scraping it, you're taking it, you're circulating it. You're investing nothing in it. And then you have the threat, not you. I know you don't work for Facebook anymore. But certainly you're doing the Jack Hughes, right? But the Facebooks of the world say, look, you don't like it? We're going to fucking shut it off and lose 20% of the population, right? Okay, so you got the threat, too. You got 230, which does nothing to regulate your content, right? To talk about truth and democracy and lies and whatever else, right? But more to the point, it's news aggregators, it's all free, and it's all honing up on other people's IP. This is the business model that we've created, and now we're wondering why journalism is under threat because they can't clear their costs. And now what we're seeing in local markets is people can't even, I live in Boston, a smart people town, and every single local rag is going like under except the Boston Globe, which is now sucking, right? No, honestly, it is. And it's a bummer because nobody buys the Boston Globe. We all just go online and look at boston.com and we look at whatever it is we want. We pay for nothing, right? We pay for nothing. I'm like one of those weirdos who actually pays for news content, but that's because I'm an old, right? None of my students pay for content ever. I don't really give a shit where it comes from, but if they do give a shit where it comes from, they know they can get that New York Times article either by going to another place. They don't need to go behind a paywall. Nobody can enforce the paywall, which is why The Guardian had a really bad time when it tried to have a paywall. This is not a sustainable business model, and I want to just say what's great for the consumers. Well, have we talked about what's great for them in the long run? Maybe we lose 20% of the audience now, but 10 years from now when no one can afford to make good journalistic content because it's too expensive and somebody else is owning up off it, isn't that the same problem that exists? Isn't that why we IP lawyers exist? To create value in content? And if you're just going to call it data or input or, you know, aggregation stuff that we can just scrape and use, there is absolutely, is that not undermining the incentive of intellectual property itself? I told you I'm just a simple intellectual property gal. Sorry. Yeah.
So thank you for that. There's a lot there. Let me just try to maybe unpack and respond to some of it. So not all, although there is this sort of epithet called big tech, just as a starting point, not all of these companies have the same business model and the same approach. So for example, Facebook doesn't scrape anything. That's not its business. What its business is people post what they want to post, and then the service ranks it according to sort of predicted engagement and delivers it to other users. So most of the content, news content, like all other content that is shared on a service like Facebook, is generated by the content producer, right? So the New York Times sets up a page on Facebook, presumably because they think it adds value to their effort. Now, there were challenges around how that drove or didn't drive online subscriptions that different companies had different challenges with, but for the New York Times, at least at the end of the day, I believe it's been a net positive because they've been able to drive traffic, convert more of those into paying subscribers. That's good for the New York Times, probably good for those institutions that have managed this transition well. I'm not saying they all have. I understand the concerns about the Boston Globe. The San Francisco Chronicle has similar challenges. That's where I'm from. So I'm not trying to suggest that this is sort of a panacea. I think the harder question is those entities that do actually scrape. So Google News is probably the best example, but there are many of them. Again, I do think there's agency involved, and I tend to be a big proponent of that basic fact. So if you don't want your stuff scraped, you just say so. The first line of your HTML code on your website. Google will leave you alone. You won't show up in Google News. Now, you're going to need to find a different way to find traffic. And And there are other tools available. Maybe you buy Facebook ads. But there are, you're an online publication. Now you need to find traffic somehow, some way. If Google News works for you, great. Let them index you. When traffic arrives, you're able to monetize that either through driving subscriptions or through ad impressions. That's just the reality of the technology we're faced with today. I don't really have a judgment as to whether it's good or bad, but we're not going backwards. The technology, I tend to be a little bit of a technological determinist, and it's the same point I made about AI. It's happened with respect to the internet. It's happening with respect to AI, and the institutions that are able to manage that transition well are doing fine now, and they're going to continue to do fine. It's just going to look a lot different than it has. Why don't I pause there? I know I probably answered about 3% of what you asked, but
I just one little comment on that is that the technology changes work. It's easy to just sort of put all of these changes into the internet, but the local newspaper regime that we had in the U.S., the urban daily regime, was largely an outfall of the costs of moving paper in trucks. Other countries, more dense populations, didn't have this vast number of papers in geography because you could move the paper in time for it to be relevant in the morning. So you would have, you could have a national newspaper, and we didn't really have that for a long time, mostly because it's expensive. It takes a lot of energy to move this heavy paper around. And getting rid of that infrastructure is a giant savings in a lot of ways. So it comes with some downsides. But so I wrote in my dissertation, years ago, was looking back and counted up Monica Lewinsky stories about the blue dress. And every paper, there were thousands of stories so that everybody could have their own local perspective on that blue dress. This technology has taken away this kind of duplication, and in every city we need people saying kind of the same thing. And instead, but what's replaced it is in many ways better, but not in always better. So we now have a lot more attention at the New York Times, a lot more attention at the very top outlets. And people do pay. New York Times is incredibly profitable. They do pay. I think underlying what we want is we want people to want better things, and they don't. That to me is, I think, that one of the largest problems is we would like people to want to read different things than they do. And this is not a supply side problem. It's how do we get people to want those things when there's all kinds of games and other types of stuff around. And so, okay, I know we're out of time.
So we have run way over, and I'm sorry. I think we'll take a 5-minute break. I want to thank our panelists. I'm sure that there's more questions. And if you...
Okay, let's get started. All right, after that very bracing panel about, yes, there's a problem, but is it on account of news aggregation or other phenomena in economic or technological phenomena, we will now take up the issue of potential solutions, assuming that the problem does have something to do with news aggregation, may not have everything to do with news aggregation, but as Bhamati indicated, there's probably something there. And I might suggest that it's only a little bit disingenuous, sorry, Colin, to say that if you don't want to be scraped, just don't be listed, right? That's death. So the problem is that Google, who incidentally declined to participate in our symposium, Google does not give the option of being listed but not scraped. So that is a potential issue that may be addressed in the next two panels. Certainly not only Google, but just in response to the specific scraping issue. Okay, so this panel is going to talk about IP solutions to the problem of news aggregation. And the next panel will talk about non-IP, specifically antitrust and bargaining solutions. And I will leave to Sham the introduction of that panel, just to point out that IP may not be a solution. There may be, you might have fabulous copyright or ancillary right protection, and it still doesn't do you any good if, for example, the aggregators decide that they just want to cut your country off. So the discussion we're about to have is only one aspect of the broader problems that we began to air in the first panel. With respect to that, we will start with Edouard Trépose of the University of Paris, who will talk about the solution that has been adopted in the European Union, which is to create an ancillary intellectual property right, not a copyright right, and he may explain why not a copyright right. We will then turn to Andrew Follia of the Copyright Office, who will talk about the Copyright Office study on the availability of copyright protection and the desirability or not of extra copyright or non-copyright IP protection. And then Neil Netanel, who is kindly joining us from Israel, he is otherwise at UCLA, will talk some more about the desirability or not of ancillary IP rights. So with that,
thank you so much, Jane, and I'm very happy and very grateful to Jane and Pippa for inviting me to present the EU answer, and we will see if it's really an answer, the EU answer to that very complex question. I think first it is important to keep into your mind that in Europe, we love neighboring rights, and we have a lot of neighboring rights. We have classical neighboring rights for performers, for producer, and broadcasting organization, and it is related to the international context, WPPT and Rome Convention. But we also have some different style of ancillary right. We have a right for the maker of a database. To make it simple, in the decision faced in the US, the directory was not protected by copyright, and it would have been the same in Europe because there is no originality. But in Europe, if the maker of a database is able to prove any investment, then he will have a sui generis right on the database. And also, we have another kind of neighboring rights for national sports events. So that's important to have into our mind, and that may explain why we have decided to move and to create a new kind of related right. Also, it is important to keep into your mind that this EU move was related to move already made by national member states. So in Germany, there was a modification of the copyright law in 2013 in order to create a new related right for press publishers, but it was a failure since Google refuses to negotiate. In Spain, a new law entered into force in 2015 January, and Google's News Spain was closed in December 2014. And in France, there was a proposal, but the proposal was given up. So, what are the justification at an EU level for this new related right for press publisher in order to get a better share of remuneration, a better share of revenue? We spoke about democratic society and a need for a free and pluralist press. This is clearly one of the justifications of the EU new related right. And also we spoke about investment, and it is really also one of the justification press publishers should have been able to recoup their investment in order to produce reliable information. And another justification is related to the fact that with these new online services, and it is clearly said in the EU directive, it is less easy to license and to get a better remuneration. So the goal was to give to the press publisher a better bargaining position by securing the legal certainty. But there is two questions which remain unclear. Why a failure in Germany or in Spain would become a success in Europe? And also, there is something which was not really discussed, is why do we need a new IP right? What about copyright? Why copyright should not be sufficient? And there was a very interesting case in Belgium, and CopyPress was able to win against Google based on copyright. And from my French perspective, it is important to keep into your mind that a press publisher have all the right, morals and economic right on the publication. And there is a legal assignment for articles written by journalists. So copyright would have been interesting. But clearly, as I said, the goal is to strengthen the position of press publisher. And the Achilles heel of copyright is to prove originality. And the new strength of this press publisher right is to be automatic. It's not related to any condition. You don't have to prove originality or investment. And that was a way to give a better position to negotiate. So the question becomes clearly, what do we consider in the EU as a press publisher? Because if you are a press publisher, then you will benefit from this new right. The characterization of a press publisher is related to what is a press publication. And the key element is a publication under the initiative, editorial responsibility, and control of a service provider. We spoke about the New York Times. The New York Times will not benefit in the EU of this new law. We have a strong discrimination, and it is made only for EU press publisher. There is no national treatment because there is no international convention, as I explained. Exclusion for scientific or academic publication, but inclusion related to press agencies. Press agencies are considered as being press publisher, and Google tried to forget that in France, and the French competition authority reminds that press agencies are included. So what is exactly the scope of this new press publisher right? The scope of the right is limited to online use of press publication by information society service provider. So it's only for the online use, and it does cover reproduction right and making available. And clearly, as I said, the added value is that the right is automatic. You don't have to prove anything related to the content. The goal was to get a better remuneration, and so we thought at the EU level that a duration of protection of 2 years should be sufficient in order to obtain this better remuneration. But also there was a strong fight in order to obtain a good balance between protection and freedom of expression. That's why we have exception for private and non-commercial uses, act of hyperlinking, and very short extract of press publication. And that's clearly a big issue. What is a very short extract? Finally, one more question related to the EU choice in favor of this new right for press publisher. The real question is the price. The real question is how much. And the EU directive is not very elaborated on that point, only it only said the share has to be appropriate. The French implementation is a bit more elaborated, and at the French level, we have to take into account the revenue related to aggregation and any kind of revenue, direct or indirect, and it could include data. So that's also something interesting. So on a theoretical point of view, the tool seems quite interesting. But on a practical point of view, the tool was not really sufficient. Why? Because France was the first country to implement the Article 17. So France is a good laboratory to understand how it works. And the reaction by Google was really clear. And I do quote, "When the French law comes into force, we will no longer display an overview of the content in France for European press publisher unless the publisher has made the arrangement to indicate that it is his wish." So French publishers accepted Google condition and give free license on their content. From an IP perspective and related to the EU directive and the French implementation, there was no problem because nothing was said related to free license and related to the non-waivable nature of the right. So press publishers were able to accept free license. So that's why French press publisher decided to add a new battlefield, not only related to IP, but to add competition law. And that was very interesting to see how this question moves from IP law to competition law. The French Competition Authority considers that Google may hold the dominant position and that Google may abuse its dominant position by circumventing the goal of the law by imposing free license. The goal of the law was to get a better share of remuneration, and finally the result was free license. It was a way to circumvent. And so the French Competition Authority ordered Google to negotiate in good faith. So we thought with a little help from the Competition Authority, negotiations should become more fruitful for press publishers. The decision was upheld by the Paris Court of Appeal, and the Paris Court of Appeal said that Google's behavior neutralized the effet utile of the press publisher right. But even with this injunction, Google did not really respect the injunction because Google imposed a global discussion to press publisher, a discussion not being focused on press publisher rights, and so the authority issued a fine of 500 million euros. Finally, the end of the story for that litigation in France is quite recent, in June 2022, and Google's accepted some commitments, and Google made commitments that were accepted by the competition authority and that closed the proceeding on that issue. So what are the commitments undertaken by Google? To negotiate in good faith, and the negotiation has to be specific to the press publisher right. Google undertake to communicate the information necessary for transparent evaluation. And we have an independent trustee. Neutrality of negotiation. To make a proposal within 3 months. And if the proposal is not accepted, arbitral tribunal in order to fix the price. And then monitoring of commitments by an approved independent trustee. So what do the commitments tell us? First, the key question is the price and how to fix it. Transparency is certainly needed. But what is the most striking point is the need for a third party, a neutral party, in order to fix that price. We do have an independent trustee. We do have arbitrator. So that's, I think, one thing which is really interesting related to the EU and the French experience. IP could be an interesting tool. Perhaps the EU ancillary right should be strengthened, and the Czech Republic decided to implement by imposing a must-pay obligation. But perhaps the answer from Google would be, we don't work with Czech Republic anymore, we'll see. So IP is not sufficient. And the combination of IP and competition law was interesting, but clearly my perspective is that what is striking is, at the end, the need for a neutral and third party in order to be able to fix that price. And I heard that in Greece, it's still a proposal, but arbitration might become an obligation in order to fix that price. So it's perhaps to show that IP is an answer, but not the only one, in order to get a well-balanced negotiation and in order to obtain a better share of remuneration. Thank you so much.
Okay, switching to the IP landscape in the United States.
Hi, everyone. I'm Andrew Foglia. I'm a senior counsel for policy and international affairs in the U.S. Copyright Office. I want to thank Jane and Pippa for inviting us. So today I'm going to present on our report on copyright protections for press publishers, which we launched last June. By way of background, our report was the result of a year-long study conducted at Congress's request, or some members of Congress, rather. In May of 2021, senators requested a study of ancillary copyright protections for press publishers, such as they have in the EU, that would, quote, require aggregators to pay publishers for excerpts of content. Edouard just spoke about these. So what did we find? Well, we found a great deal of agreement that the internet has disrupted the press publishing ecosystem. You heard about that from panel 1. We also found substantial disagreement about the effect of aggregation. You heard about that as well from panel 1. The only points I will pull out briefly, I do want to emphasize 2 points. First, while there are an awful lot of kinds of aggregators, both in size, scale, and what they do, how much of the content they take, the comments in our study were focused in particular on a particular kind of aggregation, that is the unlicensed use of headlines and leads by the very largest platforms and social media channels. And second, I'll say that we did not attempt to resolve the economics question that they described earlier. We cited many of the economists, we have a perspective, but we didn't try to resolve it. That's not really our ambit. So we also looked abroad at international models like you just heard about. So for example, in the 2010s, both Spain and Germany legislated additional protections for press publishers. Germany's was an exclusive right approach for commercial uses of their texts. It had exceptions for individual words or very short extracts or for mere linking. Spain took a different approach. They had a non-waivable right of remuneration. And as you heard earlier, the result of that was Google News exited Spain. And so a lot of our economics study, the empirical studies on the effects of aggregation come from that event. Again, we can't resolve, the Copyright Office, we did not try to resolve this debate. I will say only that we did not find significant evidence that that move helped Spanish publishers. Finally, there's EU Article 15, which you just heard about. The point about EU Article 15 I want to emphasize is that prior to Article 15, some EU countries did give direct ownership, copyright ownership rights to press publishers, others did not. So there was a harmonization aspect in Article 15. In the US, by contrast, publishers frequently own the copyright in their individual articles through the work made for hire doctrine and other mechanisms. The result is that if I go out tomorrow and copy a particular New York Times article, there's not going to be much question that the New York Times is standing to assert copyright infringement against me. That's not always the case in other parts of the world. So in addition to these ancillary copyright or neighboring rights approaches, there are also competition approaches, which you've heard about. Edouard spoke about what's going on in France. In the United States, there's been a lot of discussion about a bill in both the Senate and the House called the Journalism Competition and Protection Act, or JCPA. And most famously, Australia passed its News Media Bargaining Code, which has a mandatory bargaining right for press publishers, backed by the threat of binding arbitration. An important point about that is that because it's not in copyright law, it can apply to content that would not be protectable in copyright. So, those are the background facts. What did we actually find? Well, first we found that publishers in the United States generally have substantial copyright protections. They typically own the copyright in their entire print volumes or in their websites as collective works. They also often own or can assert rights in individual articles via the work made for hire doctrine or assignments or licenses. I'll bracket off news photographs because that's a whole other topic with some different analysis that applies. Now again, those ownership rights via the work made for hire doctrine in some ways distinguish us from the pre-Article 15 context in the EU, at least some countries. Now, those rights are subject to limitations. For example, facts and ideas are not copyrightable. Now, granted, that is distinct from the expression of those ideas. So the fact that Gerald Ford pardoned Richard Nixon is not protectable. His expression of that fact in his autobiography is protectable, which was at issue in a Supreme Court case, Harper and Row. Second, there's the merger doctrine. I'll note that we didn't actually see any cases applying the merger doctrine to headlines, but in theory, there are functional aspects of headlines, particularly short and like not evocative ones, that might put the merger doctrine into play. And third, there's the short phrases doctrine. The Copyright Office has said that, quote, words and short phrases, such as names, titles, and slogans, are not copyrightable because they contain a de minimis amount of authorship. Now again, we don't see cases applying the short phrases doctrine to headlines or leads, nor do we see anyone attempting to register headlines or leads independent from any articles, but in theory, it's a potential limitation in this area. And then most importantly, there's fair use. Now, our report briefly walked through the fair use analysis in this area, and I'm going to go even more briefly through it. First, purpose and character. We know that news reporting is one of the illustrative purposes in the text of Section 107. We also know that being one of those illustrative purposes is not enough on its own. So, for example, again, in the Harper and Row case, you have the Nation essentially like scooping publication of Gerald Ford's autobiography. And the court said that's not fair. You are like arrogating to yourself the valuable right of first publication. We also know that it matters if you have an absence of commentary or criticism. So, for example, in the LA News Service versus Reuters cases, court held that one news organization's rerunning of footage of the Rodney King riots from another news organization without additional commentary, not fair use. Finally, we also know linking and indexing can be transformative through the Perfect 10 the Amazon case and also Authors Guild v. Google Books. Second factor, nature of the copyrighted work. Well, we all agree there's going to be thin protection here because it's factual content, and we also know that the second factor is very, very rarely influential in the analysis. Amount and substantiality. We know that the more you take, the higher risk you run of taking a substitutional amount. So, for example, in the Second Circuit, there was a case, I think Fox News v. TV Eyes, where a site was indexing news clips, and some of these clips would run for as much as 10 minutes, and the court said, no, 10 minutes is really all the viewer's going to want from this. This is clearly substituting for the news footage itself. But we also know that you can sometimes take the whole of a copyrighted work as long as you're only taking what's necessary for your transformative purpose. So again, that's Authors Guild v. Google Books and other cases. So the issue here is that headlines and leads, there aren't much as a percentage of the article. It's a very small amount. On the other hand, you might argue that they are a substantial amount. They might be the heart of the work. Fourth factor, market harm. So we heard again about the substitution or market expansion, or the substitution versus complementarianess effect. One question you might ask here is, if there is substitutional harm, is it the kind of harm that copyright cares about? So in Authors Guild v. Google, and to some extent in the Oracle v. Google case, they tell us that we have to consider the kind of harm here. If the substitution happens because the reader is interested in a fact, a non-protectable fact, and they get that fact reading the headline from an aggregator, and they don't click through, is that the kind of harm that copyright cares about? On the other hand, you have to ask what would happen if this kind of copying is systematic, which with aggregation it generally is. So if you think that maybe some kinds of aggregation benefits some publishers, oftentimes maybe it's good for the New York Times, maybe it's harmful for others, but in aggregate, on the whole, you think that it undermines the production of original journalism, that might tilt against your fourth factor analysis. So because fair use is fact-specific, we did not attempt to offer an advisory opinion on whether aggregation in general is fair use. We just ran through those factors. So in addition to fair use and those copyright limitations and protections, there are some other non-copyright protections that publishers have. You heard about, I think Colin mentioned earlier, the robots.txt exclusion. If you don't want to be crawled, you theoretically can put a bot exclusion. You can also have paywalls. And these protections are theoretically backed up by statutory and common law protections, although oftentimes those have not been tested. So it's not totally clear how effective those would be. So in general, there are protections, there are limitations. The problem, according to many of the commenters in our studies, is that those protections aren't effective because they feel the publishers feel they don't have the bargaining power to actually enforce those protections or insist on them. In other words, they feel the protections are failing them for reasons outside of copyright law. So what did we recommend? Well, first, we said that new rights are probably not necessary. For the reasons I described, publishers already have copyright protections in the US, and they have copyright ownership here, which is not the same. They're just not in the same position that some EU publishers were pre-Article 15. Second, we said new rights probably wouldn't be effective. The publishers themselves tended to say that the competitive imbalance was the actual problem they were dealing with. Whatever protections we might give them, they would feel compelled to waive in order to get that flow of referrals from Google and Facebook and others. As somebody colorfully put it a few weeks ago, in this situation, giving them additional rights would be like trying to protect a bullied child by giving him additional lunch money. So third, we said new rights are almost by definition new rights by definition would have to raise constitutional and policy issues. Again, because publishers in the US have these copyright protections, and the limitations are the the idea, expression, dichotomy, non-copyrightability of facts, and fair use. Those limitations are all rooted in the First Amendment or have First Amendment dimensions. So to the extent you want to go beyond those, you are necessarily pushing into areas that have constitutional dimensions here, and also possibly international treaty obligations. So for those reasons, the office did not recommend adopting new protections in the United States. To put it succinctly, we see a problem, but we didn't see evidence it was a copyright problem or that it necessarily has copyright solutions. And we did not wade into the competition issues. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And Neil, on ancillary IP rights.
All right, everybody see my slides? Yeah? Okay. So it's a pleasure to be with you online. I'm sorry to miss being with you in person. My talk draws upon, sorry, just a second. There we go. Okay. My talk draws upon my law review article mandating support for quality journalism. It's in the readings for the symposium if anyone wants to dig more deeply into these issues, from my perspective at least. All right, so the rationale for the EU press publishers' right is set out in the preambles to the Single Digital Market Directive, as Edward pointed out. Paragraph 54 highlights the essential role of a free and pluralist press for the proper functioning of a democratic society. Paragraph 55 notes that it's important to ensure the sustainability of the publishing industry and thereby to foster the availability of reliable information. So I wholeheartedly agree with these laudatory goals. Our democracy depends on a robust, vibrant press committed to original journalism and to journalistic ethics. And I want to push back a bit against Lisa and Colin from the first panel. I do not think this is just a matter of consumer sovereignty. Rather, I think it is incumbent on a democratic government to support a quality journalism. However, right, as I argue in my article, I think that both the press publisher's neighboring rights, and for that matter, any copyright the press publisher has in news articles, are likely to be ineffective in addressing newsrooms' dramatic loss of revenue in recent decades. And further, those IP rights miss the mark in terms of identifying what is causing that loss of revenue. So some background to this. Certainly in the United States, and this is also drawing upon repeating a bit what was said in the first panel, newsrooms have suffered a precipitous decline in recent years. In the United States, the government provides relatively little financial support for the press, far less than other advanced democracies provide for the press. Rather, American newsrooms are heavily dependent on commercial advertising. And from 2005 to 2022, newspapers suffered a decline in ad revenue of 81%, right? Huge drop in ad revenue. Projections are that that drop will continue in the years ahead. Newspapers do earn about $5 billion per year in digital ad revenue. That is expected to surpass print ad revenue in 2026, but it's not nearly enough to make up for the devastating losses in print ad revenue over the last couple of decades. And tellingly, digital ad revenue has been fairly flat, even as unique visits to newspaper websites have increased substantially. So that decline in ad revenue has severely impacted news publishers' ability to provide the journalism upon which our democracy depends. Newsroom employment fell by 26% between 2008 and 2020. That's a loss of 30,000 jobs out of a total of 114,000. Newspaper newsroom employment was hit even more severely. Newspaper newsroom employment declined by just short of 60% from 2006 to 2021. So what media scholars refer to as quality journalism has been particularly hard hit. Original investigative journalism is the most expensive journalism to produce. And newsrooms often cut back on that to save money. Maybe not the New York Times, maybe not the Washington Post, but other outlets. In addition, local news has been very badly impacted. Numerous areas of the United States are now news deserts. There is no local news coverage at all in vast stretches of the United States. Now, there are a number of reasons for newsrooms' dramatic decline in revenue over the past couple of decades. They include the financial collapse, the global financial collapse of 2008, and the loss of classified advertising to Craigslist and other online classified ad providers. But in recent years, one factor looms particularly large, I argue, and that is the overwhelming market power of digital platforms, particularly Google and Facebook. The digital platforms, again, particularly Google and Facebook, inflict multiple wounds on news publishers. First, Google and Facebook have devoured the advertising revenue upon which American news publishers have heavily depended. Google and Facebook together earn more than half of all U.S. digital advertising revenue. And their closest competitor, Amazon, earns slightly over 11%. Google and Facebook also account for more than 70% of global digital advertising revenue growth. Importantly, moreover, the digital platforms do not only devour advertising revenues that might otherwise go to news publishers. They also exercise extraordinary market power and engage in considerable self-dealing in various aspects of the complex digital advertising market. In that regard, first and foremost, Google and Facebook enjoy enormous advantages in attracting advertising to their platforms. right? They can offer advertisers unparalleled audience reach, state-of-the-art display and ad placement technology, and precise consumer targeting to a huge audience. But Google and Facebook don't merely attract advertiser dollars to their respective platforms. They also run electronic auction marketplaces for digital display ads, and they act as brokers for website proprietors, including many news publishers, in selling ad space to digital advertisers, and they take a considerable cut of advertising revenues in that role. Further, in addition to harming news publishers by devouring ad revenues, the digital platforms have become a vital gateway to readers for most newspapers. As a result, digital platforms have co-opted news publishers to additional roles as curators, editors, and distributors of journalists' work product, thereby diminishing news publishers' ability and incentive to maintain a distinct brand representing quality journalism. Today, increasing proportions of readers, particularly younger readers, look to Facebook or YouTube or Instagram or, God forbid, TikTok, right, as their primary gateway for news, including news articles that they reach through these social media platforms. All right, so Edward and Andrew have discussed respectively the EU Press Publishers' Right and the U.S. Copyright Office study whether the U.S. should adopt a press publisher's right. A press publisher's right, as I noted, is a neighboring right, is an IP right that stands over and above any copyrights that press publishers hold in the news stories. Under Article 15 of the EU directive, European press publishers have an exclusive right vis-a-vis quote-unquote information service providers to reproduce and make available to the public copies and extracts of press publications. The target of press publisher right, information service providers, would primarily be online news aggregators like Google News and the Google Search News tab. These reproduce and display headlines, reduced size images, and in some cases, short extracts from newspaper articles. Facebook's display of news article extracts that are posted by its users would be covered by general copyright law, both in the US and in the EU, not by Article 15. Under Article 15, news aggregators like Google would in theory have to negotiate with press publishers for a license to copy and display news story extracts unless the extracts are quote unquote very short, or whatever that might mean. It's certainly more likely than just the headline and headlines and the images would be very short extracts than also the story leads. Now, the reason why granting press publishers IP rights is unlikely to provide press publishers with significant revenue is that it is far, far more valuable for press publishers to have the headlines and short extracts of their news stories displayed by major aggregators like Google News than it is for platforms to display the news stories. As I mentioned earlier, newsrooms are heavily dependent on platforms as gateways to their readers. But for major platforms like Google and Facebook, news articles are a tiny fraction of the content they distribute and display. In fact, Facebook is generally moving away from news content. It's recently been reported that Meta has informed U.S. news publishers that it will not renew licenses to pay for U.S. news content on Facebook's news tab. The Wall Street Journal reports that Facebook's move away from news was influenced by, quote, the stepping up of regulation around the world aimed to require technology platforms such as Facebook to pay for news, unquote. So the platforms are in a far stronger negotiating position than are the news publishers in bargaining for licenses to display news story extracts, right? The bottom line is that the platforms are ready simply to walk away, right? And the news publishers desperately need the platforms to access readers. And we've already seen this market imbalance, right? When Germany enacted a press publisher's right, Google announced that any news publishers wishing to be indexed in Google News had to grant Google a royalty-free license to display extracts of the news articles. All of the major news publishers in Germany eventually agreed to Google's demand rather than be excluded from Google News. Then in Spain, news publishers reported a non-waivable compulsory remuneration right against digital platforms that post links to or excerpts of their news stories. Google responded by closing its entire Google News site in Spain. And the result was a net decrease in internet traffic to Spanish news publishers' websites, particularly those of small publishers. So the bottom line is that merely granting Newsroom a press publisher's right is unlikely to bring press publishers significant additional revenue. That was also the conclusion of the Copyright Office in its study. In addition, right, as I said earlier, the press publisher's right misses the mark in terms of identifying what is causing the press publisher's devastating loss of revenue. News publishers are not losing revenue because Google News is displaying headlines and extracts of the news stories. If anything, news aggregators like Google News appear to generate greater traffic to news publishers' websites overall. That's why news publishers are so eager to have their stories listed in Google News. In that regard, preliminary data suggests that Google News listings do not substitute for reading the news articles on the news publisher's website. Now, we need more data about this to come to a definitive conclusion, but I did find this 2020 search optimization consultant study of click-through rates by mobile phone users. It indicates that mobile phone users click through to Google News sources slightly less frequently than a click through to organic results on the Google search generally. But the differences are very small, right? So that suggests to me that Google News listings are probably not serving as substitutes for news articles any more than Google's general organic search result listings are serving as substitutes for visiting the listed websites. So as Lisa George noted, right, in the first panel, Google News appears to serve as a complement to the news articles, right? The news websites, not as a substitute, right, for those news articles. The devastating harm to news publishers stems rather far more from Google's and Facebook's dominance in the digital advertising market. The news publishers, importantly, would be suffering a devastating loss of revenue in advertising, even if Google and Facebook stopped displaying any news stories at all. So to the extent that the press publisher's right is designed to remedy newsrooms' financial woes, it is simply off target. So what might be some more promising remedies for news publishers? Well, there's several of them, right? One is competition law, or maybe some combination of competition law and IP law that's been briefly mentioned, and I think it will be a further focus of the next panel. In my article, I recommend a 2.5% excise tax to be imposed on digital advertising revenue of the leading digital advertisers, with proceeds allocated to support quality journalism. Such a tax in the United States would yield over $3 billion per year that could be allocated to quality journalism. And I also advocate various measures that want to give more prominence to original news reporting, right? So press publishers would have greater incentive to invest in quality journalism. All right, well, I'm happy to, and I also advocate API for news publishers, curated news, right? I don't have time to go into any of those proposals now, but I'd be happy to discuss in the Q&A if anyone wishes to take that up.
Thank you very much. Pippa? Where's Pippa? Yeah, how much time do we have for questions?
10 minutes.
Okay, great. All right, so first of all, do any of the panelists want to react to anything any of the other panelists said? Andrew?
So, I mean, I guess while I'm thinking about how else I want to respond, I'll say, thank you to the other panelists and to both to this panel and earlier. A lot of people who are in the room today, we drew on their work for this report, so we're very grateful for their efforts in this area. I think responding to Neil's last point about other options besides, an ancillary right or additional copyright protections, I didn't mention earlier, but our office similarly drew on some of the suggestions. We didn't opine on them exactly, but the excise tax is I think been proposed not just by Neil, but a few other economists as well, as an interesting proposal for generating additional, public nonprofit funding public funding for journalism, especially nonprofit journalism. On the idea of combining competition law and an IP right, such as Edouard discussed as well, as I said in the Copyright Office, we can't comment on the competition issues exactly, but we have received more questions about this, particularly because the latest versions of the JCPA have more of a, I think they added a mandatory bargaining or an arbitration component like you see in Australia and like has been proposed in Canada. So sometimes we'll get asked, okay, now do you have a position in Copyright Office? And no, we still don't want to get into it. But I will say, just sort of as background, as an additional element, to the extent that these sort of competition bills add a copyright component, we would still have to think about the copyright limitations I discussed earlier, whether these would raise constitutional issues. I'm not saying they do, but for example, one criticism of the Australia proposal is that there's effectively a must-carry element to it. Then the U.S. has legal ramifications that are currently sort of actually kind of shifting under our feet in the Supreme Court. But so I'll leave it at that.
No, I think I do agree with what have been said, and clearly, at least the French experience of the implementation of the Articles 15, we have to conclude, as you did, that ancillary right is not the good solution, and even a combination of IP and ancillary right should not be a good solution. And finally, trying to find a well-balanced negotiation, that's clearly the key issue, and perhaps arbitration might be. We will see how it will work with Google's commitment related to arbitration, but perhaps that's a good solution. And also, just one point which was really interesting, it is important to keep into your mind that in EU, ownership of copyright is not harmonized. A lot of copyright questions are harmonized, but moral right is not harmonized, and ownership not harmonized because of the UK, but perhaps since we will have harmonization, we'll see. But that's another question.
Yeah, I have a further comment. So, to my mind, laws that require mandatory bargaining and mandatory arbitration are not really IP laws. I mean, it's purportedly combine competition law with IP law. If you're merely requiring mandatory bargaining, I think the price that the parties would, the rational economic price for a license that would be paid would still be zero, right? Because the value to the aggregators of carrying the news stories is so far less than the value for the news publishers. So adding the compulsory arbitration component really is asking the arbitrator simply to require some kind of payment, right? Which isn't really related to the intellectual property, the value of the intellectual property right? It's effectively a tax, right? That the arbitrator is imposing. I guess that's the way I kind of conceive of those provisions, such as in Australia, the mandatory bargaining code is part of the competition law. This is part of the IP law, right? And then I have a question for Edward. My understanding is that the German Competition Authority rules on a similar provision as in France that that Google did not was not in violation of German competition law, right, by insisting upon a royalty-free license. So there's some question as to whether the French Competition Authority actually got it right. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, or maybe that's more of a question for the next panel.
So the question in that decision, the French Competition Authority did not decide on the merit. It was only an interim decision, and so it was only the position of the Competition Authority was only to say Google may hold a dominant position, but it did not decide that Google has effectively a dominant position. He said it may hold a dominant position because of this possible dominant position. There is a risk also of abuse of dominant position, and we do see the risk. We do not say that the risk really exists, but we do see the risk, and we order interim measure in order to avoid an effective harm resulted to this potential position. It was an interim decision and not a decision on the merit.
I think we're all in agreement that mandatory bargaining is not an IP solution, but there's still the question of what are you bargaining over? So are you bargaining over the reproduction and making available the content? Are you bargaining over access to the website? That will be the subject of the next panel. So this is not to say that IP is totally irrelevant, but I think there seems to be general agreement that the principal issue is a bargaining issue. So we have a couple of minutes if there are questions. Yeah, Lisa.
Thank you very much. This is interesting panel. So I liked the framing from Neil in the sense of what's sought here are funds for publishers. We can argue about whether that's good or not, but there's a separation between the mechanism that those funds go and the do they get transferred or not. And so maybe our first panel was very demand side focused, and this one was very supplier side focused. But I think in these mechanisms, a very important thing that didn't come up here is how the interventions would change the incentives for supply, how they would change what's available to consumers, and so how they would behave. And so there's a big difference between this negotiated price type of approach and a subsidy approach. And what I can see from a negotiating over price is that every digital firm, every link that goes up, there's a balance between revenue and cost. So you put up a certain link, it brings in a certain amount of ad revenue, boil it all down, and there's not a lot of cost to that right now. There's space. And if you bargain for a price, then a particular link might come with a price. Okay? And so that changes what links are profitable to put on your site. And so it seems very clear to me that when faced with a price, even if it's bargained, that a platform would say, you know, it's not really worth posting to the San Francisco Chronicle on that point. Our algorithm, you know, it's not conscious every single person, but let's just put up something from this startup blogger. And that we would have a decrease in the quality of what's available on the platforms. And so like the economist side, that's what we worry about. Whereas you don't get that distortion if you provide funds in a different way. So anyway, that's kind of my I'm throwing econ takes in at the talks.
No, it's actually an interesting point, because in the comments on our study, the criticism you get most often of the Australia approach is that this is going to be a windfall for the biggest publishers, because that's all like the largest platforms are going to care about. We'll make our deal. No, I'm not disputing it. That's an interesting possibility. I hadn't considered that particular aspect.
Dana, you had your hand up.
Well, I was going to ask Neil, what would be the First Amendment implications if the government directed social media websites to prioritize original content?
Is that a question for me? I can't hear the audience questions, I'm sorry. So if it's a question for me, I'll have to ask Jane to repeat the question in the mic so I can hear.
We can also repeat for.
Yeah, oh, I think I can, I think you can hear me now. Yeah, I was gonna ask what the First
I can hear
Amendment.
you, but I didn't know if that was a question. Everyone's looking at the screen, so I assume that.
No, it's for
the
you,
question is
yeah,
for me.
yeah,
Okay, I didn't get a question, so.
Would there be any First Amendment implications if the government directed news aggregators to prioritize original content?
It would certainly raise First Amendment issues, and as anyone who follows this knows, First Amendment law in this area is really rapidly changing, up for grabs right now. I do argue I have a whole section part in my article where I argue that it should pass First Amendment muster. It's a content. It was a case called Turner versus FCC, which the government upheld must carry as a content neutral measure to protect at that time it was the public health, the economic health of broadcasters. And these measures would focus on preserving the economic health of journalists, regardless of what viewpoint they're expressing, right? So I do think there are arguments that can be made for why that sort of type of must carry should survive First Amendment scrutiny. But whether the current court would agree with me, I certainly cannot say with any certainty.
Okay, are there any more? Yeah.
Ariel.
I'm going to ask Colin because Ariel and Pence, you have a chance in the next panel.
Okay.
Sorry, just because we're running low on time.
This is a question for Neil, and it's really a follow-on to Lisa's point. I just want to sort of state the point a little more directly. If what we think is missing is funding for journalism, why wouldn't we simply, and I think this was one of your potential policy prescriptions, just subsidize it versus, I really am trying to understand sort of the relative merit of essentially forcing entities to pay for something that they wouldn't otherwise pay for. We've seen that, right? We've seen that, for example, Google has a global deal with News Corp, right? So when it's worth it to them, they'll pay for it. When it's not, they won't. Why would we sort of distort or impose some sort of mandatory transfer mechanism there when we can just subsidize an industry, which we do lots of?
Right. So I think, first of all, I do think that Google and Facebook have imposed financial harms on the news industry through the monopoly of digital advertising and self-dealing in digital advertising. So, I don't think it's on that score distortive to impose this excise tax on digital advertising to help fund journalism. But you're right, that is a mechanism for the government to fund quality journalism, right? I think excise taxes, they're used in other areas. They tend to be, if they're targeted, they tend to be more stable. They're, apart from, they don't require annual appropriations by Congress. So there are certain reasons why sometimes excise taxes are used to fund various services that the government wants to fund. But yeah, in theory, it could just be from the general public fist, right, that the government funds quality journalism.
Okay, I'm sorry to have to cut it off here. Ariel, I hope you will raise the point that you wanted to raise in the next panel.
We're going to go ahead and try and get started. If everyone could please take their seats. Okay, so welcome back to the third of our panels at today's symposium. So we began by trying to diagnose the problem, the various facets of the issue involving news aggregators, and then we talked about copyright seemingly not providing a solution. And so we're now going to zero in on what I guess multiple countries think the solution might indeed be, which is thinking about this in terms of a structural / regulatory approach to ensuring some level of coerced bargaining between the various players in this scene. So we're joined by a very distinguished group of speakers who are going to offer varying perspectives. We have Andrea Carson, who's joining us from Australia, where it is the middle of the night. She's joining us on Zoom. Hal Singer from Econ One, also joining us by Zoom. And here in person, we have Dana Scherer joining us from the CRS, the Congressional Research Service, and Ariel Katz from the University of Toronto. So we're going to kick things off with Dana Scherer. Each of the panelists will speak for about 8 to 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up some questions and back and forth. So without further ado, over to you, Dana.
Thank you. First, thank you all for inviting me, and I know we have our bios online, but just so you have some background about me, because it's going to inform what I say today. Congressional Research Service is a nonpartisan agency. It's part of the Library of Congress, and our job is to give nonpartisan expert analysis to members of Congress and their staff. The reports that we write are available to the public, so if you want to see about some of the comments that I'm saying today in writing, you can go to crsreports.congress.gov, including the paper that my colleague and I wrote about newspapers. The second thing, so in other words, I take no position, I'm just explaining. But unlike Andrew, I can talk about competition issues. So prior to working at Congressional Research Service, I spent about almost 10 years at Federal Communications Commission, including a 6-month detail at the Antitrust Division of the Department of Justice, plus 5 years working in the private sector at Univision. So that said, I also have a slightly different perspective today than I would have a month ago, thanks in part to my experience with my wife, Charlotte Scherer, who's up there, who used to live in Fort Myers, Florida, and I would commute there. And so my definition of local versus national has expanded somewhat in September during Hurricane Ian. I also have an aunt who lives in Port Charlotte. So in order to figure out what was going on, and particularly since she lost electricity, I searched for used Google News to search for the Fort Myers News-Gazette. And because the local television station went off the air, they relied on Facebook Live to have some weather reporting. So in order to tell my aunt what was going on, I actually did some search of local news sites from my from my desk in Washington, D.C. So that just adds some perspective. And I also noticed that the local organizations were able to give some nuance and have some details that the national organizations that were kind of flying in just didn't have. So that I relied on that. So I'm definitely on a different perspective. So that said, I'm today going to talk about 4 different bills that have been introduced by members of Congress that address provide some non-copyright policy options. And then also describe one in detail, which Ariel and Hal are also going to talk about, and which was also mentioned, the Journalism Competition and Protection Act. So first, I'm going to talk about the couple of bills that have been introduced. Some have gone further than others. One was just establishing a committee. It's called the Future of Local News Act of 2021. It would have 13 members, including 8 appointed by members of Congress, to study the state of local news, make suggestions for policy, not unlike what we're doing today. And so far, it's just been those bills in the House and Senate have been introduced, haven't gone further. The second option, which we've also heard discussed, would be providing tax breaks, including payroll tax breaks for media organizations that hire journalists, and potentially also give tax breaks to people who subscribe to local media. That proposition got a little bit further. Parts of it were included in the Build Back Better compilation, or the legislative package. It was passed by the House, but that the big omnibus bill, however, the Senate did not agree. They did not go forward with that, and so the bill that ultimately became law, known as the Inflation Reduction Act, did not include these kind of tax breaks, so that's still a possibility on the table. And then the third policy option, and this goes to what Colin mentioned about if people, news consumers use Google or Facebook to link to a website, then they can make money from digital advertising. And also Neil's point about there being Google and Facebook, but particularly Google, having such a big role in as intermediaries. And if you look at my report, you'll actually see my boxes and arrows describing all the different components. But as one senator quoted, he likened it to Goldman Sachs or Citibank owning the New York Stock Exchange. That because Google is both buying advertising on behalf of news organizations, among other entities, selling advertising on behalf, or I'm sorry, buying advertising on behalf of advertisers on media sites, and acting as the seller on behalf of media organizations, and selling its own advertising and collecting data, that it's not necessarily acting in the best interests of all the people on that entire supply chain. And for that reason, governments in Australia and Europe and now the US have proposed focusing on the ad technology component between these revenue sources. So Senator Lee, Mike Lee, introduced a bill that has some bipartisan support that would require, it's called the Competition and Transparency in Digital Advertising Act. So this would go to antitrust enforcement. That would effectively require Google to divest its ad tech divisions, and then also require any agents acting on behalf of buyers or sellers of advertising to represent their interests. Just like a real estate broker is supposed to represent the interests of people who are buying and selling houses, and they're not supposed to, coordinate or share information on both, even if it's the same agency, the same kind of rules would apply. So that's the third legislative option. And then fourth, which we're going to go into a little bit more today, is the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act. And the status of that right now in the Senate is that it was ordered to be reported by the Senate Judiciary Committee, which means that they voted on it. It would go to the Senate floor for a final vote, but they haven't, because they haven't ordered it yet, the actual bill that the Senate would vote on is not yet available on congress.gov. However, some of the aspects, I'm just going to describe it briefly since we're going to go through it more in detail, but it's essentially, it would give an antitrust exemption to media organizations, specifically owners of broadcast TV and radio stations and press publications, to collectively bargain with Google or Facebook or other social or online media organizations that meet certain thresholds. So this goes back to what we were talking about, bargaining power, to effectively give them increased bargaining power for negotiation for a limited period for 6 years. If they can't come to some sort of agreement or they can make a final offer through arbitration, there is some monitoring by government agencies, so whatever final agreement that they would come to would have to be filed by the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice. Also, the General Accountability Office would then issue a report to Congress, to kind of explain, analyzing what the developments were. So finally, I'm just going to talk about two things, because I'm going to compare that regime to another regime which is similar, and that has to do with the retransmission of broadcast television stations. So that's more my original bailiwick, having worked at the Federal Communications Commission, also a television organization. So similar to what we're talking about here, broadcast stations have the right, and also Neil mentioned this, to negotiate with cable and satellite operators for payment, or option two, if they don't think they have a whole lot of bargaining power, require their signals to be carried. But in contrast to this bill, the JCPA, there's a government agency that can act as a referee and has more of an oversight function, and that's the Federal Communications Commission. The other aspect of it is that in the Communications Act, all parties are required to negotiate in good faith, and there's some steps or factors outlined in the Communications Act about what that means and also what it does not mean, or what would not be considered bad faith. It's some double negatives. So similar to the JCPA in 2019, I think, yeah, Congress enacted a bill or a law called the Television Viewer Protection Act of 2019 that would permit small cable operators with fewer than 500,000 or fewer subscribers to collectively negotiate. So this would be giving small cable operators a leg up in their negotiations with giant broadcasting companies or big broadcasting companies. And so that's one aspect of it that's similar, but we're talking, instead of exemption in antitrust law, we're talking about kind of a carve out in communications law. And one other thing I wanted to raise here, which it goes back to my background, when I was at the FCC, I was one of the team that worked on the merger between Comcast, which is a acquirer or licensor of intellectual property rights, and NBC Universal, which is the I'm getting mixed up. Licensee is Comcast, licensor is NBC. They're the ones that own the property rights. So one of the conditions, which I drafted, so this is how I remember it, was that there would be a firewall between NBC and Comcast during these negotiations, so that Comcast couldn't use information it gained from owning NBC when it was negotiating with NBC's station's competitors, and likewise, NBC couldn't use the information from Comcast as it negotiated with Comcast competitors. Interestingly, and this again goes back to my background in working at Univision, Google made an investment in Univision Televisa in April 2021, about $1 billion, along with some private equity firms. So JCPA does not mention this, but Google actually, just like Comcast and NBC, has an insider's view on both sides of the equation. As Google, of course, would be the licensor of content, but as a strategic investor in Univision Televisa, it would also be a licensee, licensor. So there is no, so that's an issue that I think is interesting that hasn't been addressed. And I think that's about it, unless, I could respond to other questions.
Perfect. Great, thank you, Dana. So we'll now, for more on the JCPA, turn it over to Hal. Hal, can you hear us?
Yeah, I hear you fine. And thanks so much for having me. It's a real privilege to speak here, and apologize for being virtual, but I'm co-producing my first antitrust event at the University of Utah today, and I had to be here in person. By way of disclosure, I'm a consultant to the News Media Alliance, which is the coalition of U.S. newspapers. Now, among other protections for news publishers, the JCPA would grant an exemption, we just heard, to antitrust laws for news publishers so they could better coordinate their dealings with the tech giants. And before going any further, I just want to be clear, antitrust exemptions are rare, and that's a good thing. Powerful entities should not be immunized from antitrust scrutiny. In some limited circumstances, however, coordination among small suppliers when dealing with a large buyer is necessary to overcome a power imbalance that is causing input prices and employment to fall below competitive levels. This market failure is the basis for the current exemptions for farm cooperatives in particular, and for labor in general from the antitrust laws. And it is the same basis for extending a new exemption to newspapers in their dealings with dominant tech platforms. Now, the platform's massive buying power, which we call monopsony power, over news publishers is evidenced by high market shares combined with high barriers to entry. Facebook and Google account for over half of all US digital display advertising. And Facebook's bullying reaction to the mere prospects of having to pay for access to news evinces its buying power. In February of 2021, Facebook temporarily blocked news to Australians on its platforms as legislators refined the news code. And in July 2022, with Congress deliberating on the JCPA, Facebook announced that it will no longer pay US news organizations to have their material appear in Facebook's news tab. By providing a time-limited period during which publishers could coordinate their dealings with dominant online platforms for compensation, the JCPA would help balance the playing field and provide a lifeline for high-quality journalism
in America. Now, numbers explain why this is so critical. The news industry has incurred losses in advertising revenue every year since 2006, according to Pew Research. The year 2006 was around the time that the platforms solidified their market power over digital advertising. Now, this is not to say that Facebook and Google's domination of digital advertising came entirely at the expense of newspapers. Rather, it is to provide context as to how any underpayment to newspapers can exacerbate an environment that is already quite dire. Now, the effect of shrinking advertising revenues, in part caused by the underpayment from dominant platforms, is less cash flow to support journalists, a clear employment effect flowing from the exercise of monopoly power by the dominant platforms. Now, employment among newspaper employees fell from 71,000 in 2008 to 31,000 in 2020, according to Pew. And as a result of the deteriorating news media landscape, hundreds of local newspapers have been acquired or declared bankruptcy. Facebook and Google reframe newspaper articles in rich previews containing headlines, summaries, and photos. Now, the platforms also curate newspaper content alongside advertisements. This reframing and curation decreases the likelihood of a user clicking on the article, thereby depriving news publishers of clicks while enriching the dominant tech platforms. This appropriation of newspaper content also decreases newspaper subscriptions. And when the clicks on newspaper content eventually come from the platform's websites, the associated advertising revenues are taxed by the platforms at excessive take rates. Now, a study I conducted, which was commissioned by the NMA, found that allowing current market forces to dictate the newspaper's pay shares, that is the portion of platform revenues that redounds to newspaper publishers, ensures that newspapers are compensated at rates significantly below competitive levels. This underpayment results in underemployment of journalists and other news employees, and it can also be the cause of a host of social ills associated with local news deserts, including less competent local governments, greater spread of partisanship and misinformation, removal of economic stimulus to local economies, and a reduction in the diversity of viewpoints, particularly among minority populations. The best way to correct this market failure is for the government to permit news publishers to coordinate their dealings with the dominant platforms over payments and conditions as contemplated by the JCPA. Now, given the massive power imbalance, collective bargaining by itself might not be sufficient to achieve competitive payments, in which case some structured bargaining among the parties, for example, mandatory arbitration with an enforcement mechanism, would be needed as a backstop. Now, during the Senate hearing on the bill, in which I had the privilege of testifying, a would-be newspaper coalition was referred to as a cartel by the Republican witness. And I just want to explain quickly why the word cartel misunderstands, that phrasing misunderstands the term. A cartel is anti-competitive because it suppresses output. But by driving up the price for accessing news towards competitive levels, this coalition created by the JCPA would actually increase newspaper output, the exact opposite of a cartel. Calling the coalition of newspapers a cartel makes about as much sense as calling a union of unpaid college athletes a cartel. Neither would restrict output, and neither would lead to higher prices for consumers, as neither would increase the marginal costs of the respective platforms. Basic pricing theory shows that an increase in a firm's fixed costs, such as a lump sum transfer that doesn't change with output, will not affect a firm's pricing. Just as NCAA schools have not raised ticket prices or television license fees after having to pay college athletes for the rights to the athletes' names, likeness, and image, Google and Facebook would have no reason to begin charging users for search or social media, respectively. The payments to newspapers would not rise with each click, but instead would be a lump sum, fixed payment for the right to access the content. And upon making the access payment, the platforms would be free to monetize newspaper content however they desire, subject to applicable copyright law. Now, curiously, some traditional anti-monopoly groups have stated their resistance to granting countervailing bargaining power to newspapers in their dealings with dominant platforms. In a joint statement, the American Antitrust Institute, Public Knowledge, Consumer Reports, and Consumer Federation of America argued that a, quote, new antitrust exemption will only hurt consumers, citizens, and businesses that are not invited to the negotiations that this exemption is supposed to facilitate, end quote. It bears noting that some of these groups depend on the dominant platforms for funding. Now, the slippery slope argument advanced by the AAI in a white paper would have condemned the antitrust exemption originally extended to labor and farm cooperatives, as they were the first exemptions granted. And given the extremely limited scope of the antitrust exclusion proposed, newspapers will not be allowed to coordinate, for example, in their dealings with consumers. It is unclear how collective bargaining of newspapers vis-a-vis the dominant platforms over an access fee would have unintended consequences in the form of increased prices for consumers, as suggested in AAI's white paper. Now, instead of the JCPA, some detractors have called for greater enforcement of existing antitrust laws against Google and Facebook. But remember, the conduct being challenged here, which is the mere exercise of monopsony power to achieve a reduced rate for newspaper content, is not a cognizable vertical restraint under antitrust law. Scraping, reframing, and curation and appropriation of value do not amount to violations of Section 2. And unlike Europe, we don't have an abuse of dominance standard. Moreover, even if one could style something else the platforms are doing related to this activity as a cognizable restraint, a successful antitrust lawsuit against, say, Google would provide zero relief for publishers in their dealings with Facebook. And a successful antitrust lawsuit against Google or Facebook would require several years to adjudicate, and the appeals might not be resolved for nearly a decade. In the interim, newspapers would be left twisting in the wind, and given the newspaper's precarious financial state, it is not clear how long many newspapers could survive without an intervention today. Now, the JCPA has undergone significant amendments recently. I'll be quick with these. The current version wisely introduces a baseball-style arbitration process. It guarantees that publishers of all viewpoints are eligible to participate in the negotiations, and it imposes a size limit, incorrectly in my view, to focus support on small and local outlets. A more recent amendment ensures that a significant share of the funds collected at the hearing, at the arbitration proceeding, 65%, would be paid out to the members based on each member's pro rata share of a newspaper's spending on journalists. In other words, newspapers that shed journalists would be punished under the allocation mechanism, as their pro rata share of the global award would be reduced. Another amendment requires transparency on what news providers receive from platforms annually and how that infusion is spent on news production. In summary, it is my opinion that the JCPA is the best prescription available to solve a clear market failure. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Hal. So from the United States now all the way to Australia, let's hear about the Australian solution on which a lot of other models are premised. Over to you, Andrea.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to say what a great pleasure it is to be here, albeit being 3:13 in the morning. And it's really wonderful to be able to hear what's going on in the United States. I'm going to share some slides just to give some context to what's happened in Australia with the News Media Bargaining Code, which relies on competition law, which is being referred to here as antitrust. So hopefully you can see those slides that have come up. And if I could just get some indication that that's changing, that you can see the Australian background.
Up, but not on full screen mode yet. So if you want to just hit the slideshow. Perfect.
Wonderful, great. So I guess the background to the Australian context is it's been a very concentrated media environment, probably one of the most concentrated media ownership environments of any developed democracy. And it's become further concentrated over time with changes to some of the acquisition laws. And we saw one of the largest, there's two main media newspaper companies in Australia, that's Fairfax Media and News Corp, which of course is owned by Rupert Murdoch. After changes to the last raft of laws in 2017, Channel 9, one of the television stations, took over Fairfax and led to further ownership concentration. Coming off the back of the global financial crisis, newspapers had lost millions of dollars, well, billions actually, in advertising, as well as with the online competitors coming on board. And that led to an inquiry by the Australian Competition Consumer Commission, was asked to look at what the state was of media with growing concerns about misinformation circulating online, and, as Hal's explained, an uneven playing field of bargaining power of being able to attract advertising. In 2020, the ACCC reported, it made 23 recommendations. Of those, the federal government, which was a conservative government at the time, instructed the ACCC to develop the News Media Bargaining Code, which is what I'm here to talk about today. The News Media Bargaining Code was developed by 2021. It looked like it was about to come into law, and that is when Google and Facebook ran counter campaigns in Google's case, threatening that Google services would be severely disrupted with an online campaign, and Facebook pulled news for 10 days from its sites. News was defined very broadly, and it actually also pulled emergency services information sites from its platform during a time when Australia was experiencing bushfires. That caused some public backlash, but it also made some amendments to the code, which I'll go into in just a moment, which I think we can see were clearly in the interests of the big tech companies. So just a little more background, similar to what Hal has been reporting, that over time, the ACCC inquiry found that 3.48 billion was the estimated loss in classified advertising in Australia between 2001 and 2016, and that reporting staff across newspapers and television and radio had decreased by 20%. If we look at the advertising distribution in Australia, it's a similar picture, with over 80% going to Google and Facebook, which is why Google and Facebook are the two entities that are named in the News Media Bargaining Code. The other big platforms that operate in Australia at this point in time are not subject to that code, and 19% of the advertising revenue was going to the news media sector. As a consequence also of the COVID-19 pandemic, Australia was developing more news deserts in local media, with 164 outlets closing in the first year of the COVID-19 pandemic. The backlash, I've got an example there of what the advertising campaign looked like that Google ran, with that yellow triangle warning Australians that their experience would be hurt if this News Media Bargaining Code was legislated. And Facebook went one step further. Rather than threatening, it actually did pull news content. So what did the code look like? It has some criteria about who's eligible, and a news organisation must have a turnover of $150,000 per annum, which is consistent over at least a 3 or 5 year period. It needs to produce core news. Core news is not well defined, and in that 28, if you are a core news provider, you must be registered with the Australian Communication Media Authority, who oversees the News Media Bargaining Code. And from there, once you're registered, you're in a position to be able to, in theory, bargain with either Google or Facebook. Initially, before the backlash from Google and Facebook, it was going to be a one-way value exchange. What that meant was that the news media companies were able to determine what they thought their value was that was being exploited by the big tech companies. That changed after the threat of pulling news, and also of pulling news from Facebook, and the Treasurer backed down on that and made it a two-way exchange. As Hal pointed out, this code also has final offer arbitration, but there's a really important caveat here, which I want to underscore, and that is that arbitration and negotiation does not occur unless the code is actually what is known as designated or activated. And the designation power of the code resides with the Treasurer. in that designation proposition has not occurred. We have had a change of government in Australia in May in 2022. And so in actuality, the code, although it's been legislated, it hasn't been activated. So the deals that have happened up until this point in time have been with the fear of the code being activated. And by activating it, it forces the big tech companies to negotiate. At this point in time, that negotiation with news media companies has been on a voluntary basis because there hasn't been the activation. And as one can imagine, the big tech companies have only been engaging in negotiations with the larger of the media companies. Those smaller companies do have the right under the News Media Bargaining Code to collectively bargain, but because the code hasn't been activated, it makes it very hard, even when they come together as a group, to force Google or Facebook to the negotiation table. In fact, as we will see with the deals that have been done, and keeping in mind these deals are commercial in confidence, so the figures and the companies that I'm reporting here are based on media interviews and anything that has leaked out into the public sphere. There's no formal documentation of these deals because of commercial in confidence arrangements. So the threat of final offer arbitration has never been realised because the code has not been activated. To date, the law came into power in February 2021, so there's been just over a year of these negotiations. They range from 6 years to 2 years. They're not consistent. And Facebook has undertaken 14 deals that we know of, and Google has taken 20. It's by talking to some of the outlets that have gone through this negotiation process, Google has been an easier operator to deal with and more readily coming to the table with its deals. Facebook seems to have drawn a line at a given point, thinking is that it has satisfied enough deals to prevent the Treasurer from designating and forcing negotiation. So as we can see there, it's been estimated by the former head of the ACCC that $200 million has exchanged between news media companies in Australia and Google and Facebook. When we look at the recipients of those deals, it's estimated that News Corp has been the biggest winner, getting $70 million a year, and Nine, which was the Fairfax Holdings, getting $50 million from its deal, leaving a much smaller proportion going to media startups. Now, one of the important things here is that the policy intention of the code was to improve public interest journalism. However, there is no actual provision in the code that any of the exchange of money to news media companies needs to be spent on journalism. It could go to the paper stock of the annual reports for reporting annual statements. It doesn't have to be spent on journalism. And that's something that might be reviewed, given that there's been a change of government in May and we now have a Labor left of centre government. The losers of the deal, I mentioned that Facebook drew a line in the sand and just stopped negotiating about halfway through this year. It did not negotiate a deal with our second national broadcaster, the SBS, nor did it negotiate a deal with The Conversation, which is I think you've got The Conversation also in America, a non-profit outlet that uses academic resources combined with journalism to provide public interest information. The Conversations ran quite a campaign about how it was frozen out by Facebook, and that has led to no avail because there is no designation of the code. If we look at some of the major critiques since the code has come into power, it's been that the small startups are largely those under $150,000 in revenue a year excluded. They have limited capacity to collectively bargain because the code has not been designated. There's no requirement to spend the revenue on public interest journalism, which goes against the grain of the policy intention of the code. The deals are commercial in confidence and they vary in years, and there's no opacity. After the expiry of these deals, we don't know what the future holds or whether the code will ever be designated to compel the big tech companies to renegotiate these deals. But on the other hand, more optimistically, it is world first legislation. It does use competition law as opposed to copyright law to have an exchange between news media organisations and big tech companies to try and equalise that unbalanced playing field on advertising revenue. There has been little going to startups at this point, but with a review in place now, which is due to report to government this month, and that may be publicly released in the next 2 months, we might see some changes with the recommendations from the Labor government. So some conclusions perhaps up for discussion is that essentially the beneficiaries of the News Media Bargaining Code to date have been legacy media. One might argue that further distorts the market and that there's been a silencing effect from mainstream media who are quite happy to have their $200 million exchanged in the last year. That creates a path dependency for media companies that now are quite reliant on big tech as a fairly significant revenue source for them. There's no great incentives for new media startups in the Australian space, given I should say that when the ACCC did its digital platforms report in 2019 and made 23 recommendations, as Dana pointed out, one of those recommendations was also for tax breaks, both to subscribers and to news media companies. Those tax breaks were not taken up, and there's not many incentives for startups in the Australian environment, given the power imbalance to try and negotiate with big tech. And the concentrated media environment landscape still remains as such in Australia. So the next steps, as I mentioned, the Department of Treasury has reviewed the News Media Bargaining Code to see how it's performing. We don't yet publicly know what has gone into that review. It's reporting to the new government this month or last month, and hopefully we might see the public side of that later this year. What it was asked to review on was to ask media companies to make clear how many more journalists they'd employed as a consequence of these deals, whether they had invested in the professional development of journalists or investment in hardware and infrastructure, and what they see as the long-term sustainability of news businesses as a consequence of the code. I'll leave it there and happy to take questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andrea. That was very, very helpful. So we went from the United States to Australia, and then now we're going to come back to North America and have Ariel tell us about Canada and the Online News Act.
Okay, so thanks Sham and Jane and Pippa for inviting me, and thanks for coming or staying. So I'm going to talk about Bill C-18, Canada's proposed Online News Act. So it has not been enacted, is now before Parliament, being considered. And I'll try to combine, well, first kind of description of what the Act does, but also with my skepticism and some criticism of it. And I've used my University New template, which was produced because we have a new fundraising campaign with the very puzzling Defy Gravity slogan, which is kind of puzzling for a scientific institution in an area when we have attack on science. And so I decided to use it because if you see there's a kind of implied criticism of the proposed legislation, it may have something to do with that as well. But if you wondered why I have Defy Gravity somewhere on some of the slides, it's not me, it's them. Okay, so the purpose of the proposed act is to regulate digital news intermediaries with a view of enhancing fairness in the Canadian digital news marketplace and contributing to its sustainability, including the sustainability of independent local news businesses. And kind of, I think, in the family of proposed solutions, so the Canadian is kind of akin to or similar to the Australian and the JCPA, right? And it has, I think, in my view, three main features. So one, it's not really a copyright or related right model. So the legislation does not define any new rights, ancillary rights, neighboring rights, or whatever you call them. But at the same time, it kind of does. and result is something that's actually much more expensive than copyright. And I'll talk a little about that. Okay, so that's one thing. In addition, it institutes kind of a mandated bargaining process, similar with kind of designation to whom it applies, similar to Australia. But if the entities are designated, the newspapers can initiate the process, starting with negotiation sessions. If they fail to reach an agreement, they will move to mediation. If it fails, they move to final offer arbitration. And whatever the outcome of that is going to be legally binding on the intermediaries. But this option is available not only to individual newspapers, but they also can bargain collectively, which I think it really is what is the point of this legislation. And this facilitation of collective bargaining is also coupled with a rather sweeping exemption from the Competition Act. So I don't think, can we kind of use it here as competition law solution? No, it's not competition law solution. It's actually the opposite. It's by exempting from competition law. Okay, so what is really on the copyright issues? So that there are some key, I wanted to have this slide before the copyright. So to whom this apply on the intermediary side? The definition here is quite vague and potentially broad. So digital news intermediary, if having regard to the following factors, it has significant bargaining power imbalance. Okay, so what are the factors? The size. Okay, and if, with all the intermediaries, because we're dealing with network effects, so in every kind of type of service product, there'll probably be one service that is kind of dominant. So, okay, we know Google and Facebook, they're big, right? Is Reddit big? Is Twitter big? What does size here mean exactly? I don't know. What does it mean to have strategic advantage? Well, over the news businesses, of course they do different things, and they are much better in what they do than the newspapers, right? So I think this may also apply to basically any platform. And having, where they occupy a prominent market position. Well, the word is prominent, not dominant. That is the terminology of competition law, and that's intentional. So it's a much lower threshold than what would be required for competition law. You have to be prominent, but again, is Reddit prominent? Yeah, in kind of this type of thing. Yeah, they are. They're probably even dominant, rather not only prominent. So again, I think that potentially may apply not just Google and Facebook, but many, many others. Okay, now the definition, how can we start with the expensive copyright issue aspects? So there are key definitions. One is who is the digital news intermediary? Okay, these are those platforms, and including search engines, social media services that makes news content available to persons. Okay, making available to kind of sounds like copyright law, but in copyright it's available to the public. Here it's to persons, which it doesn't have necessarily to be the public, one difference. Next, what is news content? Okay, it means content in any format. There is no requirement of originality. There is no requirement of fixation. So if a news organization just transmits live a speech by a politician that they have not authored, and they don't simultaneously fix it, there would be no copyright in it, but it would still be considered news content for this legislation. Next, the definition of making available is very broad and very different from what's making available in the Copyright Act. So there are two ways of making available. One is by reproducing, but that's not really the issue. The platforms, they don't really, yeah, if they copied content and reproduce it, that would probably be sufficient for copyright, but they usually link to, if that's like the Facebook. But copyright, so is the reproduction and the providing access, facilitating access. One big difference, again, even the reproduction is a copyright issue. Reproduction in Canada is the reproduction of the work or any substantial part thereof. And we have good case law on what substantial part of it. It's not any particle. The Supreme Court says, here we have the content or any portion of it. I don't know what that means. A word, a letter, but it's clearly different from what we have in copyright. Okay, much more expensive. Then on the making available, that's entirely different. So it's about facilitating access, which is not what the making available in the Copyright Act at all. So all the linking to and indexing and all those, and aggregation, all of those activities that typically would not attract copyright liability. And even if we have like the scraping and so on, so we have fair dealing. I mean, if you read the Copyright Office report, by and large, I think Canada would fall on the same issues, right? But those activities that do not attract copyright or probably may not attract are clearly supposed to be covered by this legislation. And on top of that, we have a provision that make it clear, very clear that limitation and exception to copyright do not limit the scope of the bargaining process. Now, it's not that they may not be relevant to determine essentially the price, but the point, my understanding here is that, okay, so an intermediary would not be permitted to say, look, what we do does not infringe copyright. It falls under this exception or the other, or it's public domain material or whatever, and therefore we don't need to negotiate under this process. The answer would have to be, no, you still have to negotiate. And potentially, even if what you do does not really infringe anyone's right. So what we have here is a kind of conceptual puzzle, and Sham nodding. We all know normal dat quod non habet, the person cannot give what they don't have, but here we are forcing bargaining potentially over things that the publishers don't have, and that the intermediaries are lawfully allowed to use. So we create a kind of an entitlement without actually granting it. So I don't know, maybe it's a kind of common law thing that the right follows the remedy. We provide a remedy, and from there we deduce that there is a right. But it's a very weird thing for legislation to do. Okay, and now another difference between the mandated collective bargaining and the collective administration of copyright, which exists in many countries and also very popular in Canada. So there is a kind of optical illusion that that's a kind of similar thing, but I think it's very different from collective administration of copyright, because in collective administration, again, the standard explanation why we allow it, why we may want to encourage or tolerate it, depending on our view, is that what it does, the upside of it, it simplifies licensing, it reduces transaction costs. Now, by doing it collectively, there's a downside. We may allow the collective to exercise market power, so we introduce legislation to constrain the market power of the collective. And ideally, set the prices so they would be similar to what they would have been in a competitive market, but so we get the benefit of the reduced transaction costs without paying monopoly prices. So the point of collective administration is not to enhance the market power of copyright owners, but is to reduce the costs. Now, in collective bargaining, it's kind of the opposite. The whole point is to allow those who negotiate collectively, by negotiating collectively, to gain more than they would have done had they been negotiated individually. So we have that in labor, for example. We also have in Canada kind of underused, interesting legislation, status of the artist legislation. There's a federal act, and Quebec has a similar one. And those legislation basically implement a labor negotiation model, but not for but instead of for employees, for kind of freelance creators. So artists, creators, writers, they can create unions and negotiate collectively with the producers, the publishers, the media companies. Now, because of federalism issue, the federal legislation applies only on the producer side to federally regulated producers, which are very limited. It would be the CBC or the National Arts Gallery. Quebec has one that applies to any other type of producer, but it applies only in Quebec. But what we have here, again, it's very similar to labor model. The News Media Act does the same thing, or very, very similar thing, but instead of, in there, again, if labor, it's employees, in the side of the artists are individual artists, in the proposed legislation, it's newspapers and news organizations. And okay, so in a few minutes that I have, I just want to raise 3 issues with some kind of issue that I take issue with. Okay, some are more pragmatic, kind of call them they're smaller, medium, then conceptual, large, and one existential, extra large. So the small and medium is with respect to the exemption from competition scrutiny. Okay, it exempts both from criminal liability for price fixing, but also from section 90.1, which gives the commissioner power, if there are agreements that are anti-competitive, there is a more administrative power to go to the tribunal and seek injunctive relief. Stop doing what you're doing and change your behavior. No criminal liability, no payments, no damages. The legislation exempt from both. I think the exemption from 90.1 seemed to me not unwarranted. Too broad. In addition, their whole issue of how those negotiations happen, and they're confidential, and they can designate documents are confidential, and the Competition Commission can be involved or consulted during those process, but any document that is being submitted it remains confidential, and the Competition Bureau is prohibited from using it to any other purpose. So if during the negotiation, the Bureau learns that there are many more shenanigans going on between the newspapers, and they want to start investigation for potential on related things, it seems to me they can do that, and those documents, also the Act says they're not admissible in any other proceeding. That seems to be a problem. Okay, so these are fixable. Okay, that's why it says small or medium. The conceptual one is, okay, we allow collective bargaining in labor. The status of the artist, I think, underused, but I see some potential there. But do the media companies, is this the bargaining power imbalance between them and is akin to what we have between workers and their employers, creators and the producer? Maybe for some of them, news organizations, the smaller, the startup ones, but the Act is not limited to those, right? And the Globe and Mail and the CBC and Bell Canada that owns many other outlets, they're all going to be beneficiaries of those. I think that's a very different thing from what we see in labor or artists, and so that I feel unease about that. Also, so Michael Geis 2 days ago quoted, there's a new estimate from the PBR, I think they're equivalent to your organization, that they estimate that, again, the big beneficiaries will be the CBC and Bell Canada and the big players, and the small ones would get a much smaller share. Now, and here's it, but now I want to get to my existential concern. Now, I think we've passed the area of kind of the utopianism about tech. So we all know there are serious problems with with the kind of surveillance capitalism that undergirds Facebook and Google. There are economic problems and social problems, psychological problems, but also political problems. And we saw that during in recent years. There are a lot to be concerned about what's going on there. And we need to have the media to be vigilant watchdogs. But my big concern, and that's why I call it essential, that this type of solution basically take the watchdogs and make them beneficiary of that surveillance capitalism. Or they give them a financial stake in maintaining this model. And I'm concerned that we would see the media much less interested in undermining, in doing journalism that could potentially undermine what may become, if it works and generate a lot of money for the media, and it's important that it does, it also means that the media is going to much less criticize and be skeptical of this very model that is the source of those important funds. And this, I think, could be potentially at least to me, a very significant concern about thinking, is this the right model to solve the issue of the funding for the media? And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Okay, before I open it up, let me look at Pippa and ask how long we have for some questions. Okay, so about 15 minutes. Okay. Yeah, so let me ask if any of the panelists want to intervene and get back at any of the issues or questions that came up in the other presentations before I jump in with a question and then turn it over to the audience.
I would, if that's okay, unless someone else wants to go first.
Go ahead, Hal.
I just want to respond to the three things that Ariel just said very quickly. Maybe he can respond if he wants, but I heard three claims that I want to quibble with. The first is that he thinks this structure would force bargaining over things that they don't have, publishers don't have. But remember, what we're wanting to be compensated for is access to the content on our website, and at least under US copyright law, it is legal, but impractical, for any newspaper, if they want to throw up a firewall around their content. Right? And so the Wall Street Journal apparently considered doing it and was retaliated against by one of the platforms. The reason why they don't do it is because of how dependent even a big organization like the Wall Street Journal is on the platforms for their very viability. And so again, you got to think about what the negotiations are over is an access fee, right? And so to say that they don't have a right to command such a fee because we're bargaining over things they don't have is basically to suggest that they couldn't throw up a firewall around their content. And that's not true, at least in the United States. Second point is Ariel seems to suggest that maybe there's a power imbalance for small newspapers, but there's not between large media companies and Google and Facebook. And I think that's wrong too, respectfully. I think that you could measure this in any different way. Market cap, for example, of the platforms is a gigantic multiple of even the largest media organization. Really, the buying power is evinced by the fact that the platforms are paying effectively zero for the right to access this content. That is an example, even with respect to large content providers, of the power imbalance. Now, Ariel's idea prevailed in the United States, and we ended up cutting out the three biggest newspapers from the protections of the JCPA, largely for political reasons. And I think this was really foolish for the following reason. We don't, does LeBron James benefit from having a union? Well, maybe not so much, but would we ever want to carve out LeBron James from the union? And the answer is absolutely not, because having the biggest person remaining in the union lifts the tide for all the remaining boats. I was not able to prevail in that debate here, and I don't think I lost on economic reasons. I think I lost for political reasons. And the very last thing, Ariel suggests that the newspapers are going to become conflicted because they're going to have a stake in surveillance capitalism. And he suggests that these payments for access could change the very nature of journalism. I just want to point out that, at least as contemplated in the United States, the pot of money to be awarded will turn entirely on the valuation. There'll be an expert for the newspaper collective, and there'll be an expert for Google, and we'll redo it again for the Facebook proceeding. It'll turn entirely on the revenues that can be, the platform revenues that can be attributed to the contributions of the newspapers. And an individual newspaper's allocation is going to depend on just a few things. Its pro rata share of the traffic generated, and its pro rata share of the journalist under its employ. And I don't think, given how the award is determined and how the allocation of the award is going to be created, at least in the US, that any newspaper is going to have a perverse incentive to start changing its content so as to game or rig the allocation in a way that promotes surveillance capitalism. I don't think the two have anything to do with each other. So I just wanted to get those 3 points out. Thanks for letting me hog the mic. I'll turn it back over to Ariel.
Thanks.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Do I have to turn on something?
I think it's on.
Okay. Thanks, Hal. So, I mean, I think your first or second question is actually the question that I wanted to ask you. When we think about, do the platform have monopoly power, or did they abuse their dominance? You say that they are, but I'm thinking, do smaller players, is it a case that, Facebook does not pay for linking to content, but Reddit does? Or Google does not, but Yahoo does? And so we can say that one has this enormous power and they push prices down, the smaller one don't, and they are the one who actually pay. I don't know enough, but I don't think that this is the case. I think the small ones are not paying also, because that's not the function, right, of what they do. And just my response to your third point, I'm not saying that I'm not talking about manipulating the allocation of the money. I'm just saying my concern is about being less interested in having an active journalism that questions the economics of the models that generates this money. I mean, in a way, that's one of our kind of fundamental suspicions about why we want the private sector to fund journalism rather than the government giving money, because we consider if the government is the one who gives the money, journalists are less likely to criticize the government. So it's the same kind of problem that I'm alluding to here.
Does anyone else want to go? Otherwise, I have a question that picks up a little bit on Hal's criticism of Ariel, and I think in some ways connects back to the prior panel and to what Dana began with in talking about retransmission consent, which is the extent to which the collective bargaining or negotiation process has to be predicated on the identifiability of a pre-existing right? Because, so if we start with where Dana began, I think the evidence is fairly clear that to the extent that retransmission consent worked, it was because we recognized the existence of a public performance right under copyright, right? To the existence of some kind of an entitlement, a priori, set the default over the negotiation process. In France, to the extent that there was a penalty imposed on Google, it piggybacked on the existence of a right that the French law recognized to begin with. But what we're doing in these three regimes, seemingly, the JCPA in Canada and in Australia, is jumping over that hope of defining a clear pre-existing right, saying that we don't want to go there for whatever reason, nevertheless imposing a fair bargaining process. And the question that this raises for me is what the entitlement is that the news media have in each of these regimes that they would negotiate over. Hal says it is the ability to preclude access to your content, but that's not necessarily a right. I mean, yes, we're talking about some kind of anti-circumvention measure. So let me give you what may seem like an absurd hypothetical, and maybe you can walk me through why this wouldn't be a concern at all. Let's assume there's a news outlet called the Pirate News Media, and here's what they do. They simply copy content that is under copyright and owned by authors, but they're monetizing it through their news media outlet in some form of print. Now, they would presumably be part of the collective bargaining negotiation if the process of the Googles and the Facebooks of the world is to link to their content and monetize it in some particular way through the platforms. But under our pre-existing structure, they should have no right. They are a pirate entity. They are piggybacking on copyright and would, under the copyright regime, be completely without rights. But the regime that we're talking about, the collective bargaining, doesn't address question one, the fact that they are a pirate news media outlet, and says, no, let's talk about fair remuneration as between Google and Facebook and this entity. So what am I missing?
Is that to me? Who is that
I guess
to?
everyone,
Sorry.
because it sort of intersects with where Dana began and the three regimes that we've talked about. How would each of these regimes protect the fact that this pirate news media entity is not generating its own content? It's piggybacking as a pure pirate on authors' rights.
So at least in Canada, I think the Section 23 says would exclude your. They say if there is copyright in the news content, the newspaper can negotiate with respect to that only if they own the copyright or have been authorized to negotiate.
Okay, so if they're a pure pirate, they're totally thrown out of the.
Yes, but
it's not if they own the copyright, because this is a situation where they are completely a pirate on someone else's copyright.
and they were not. So they would be excluded.
Excluded. Okay.
Yeah, but at the same time, the regime is not limited to copyrighted content. Right? That's it's all very strange.
Got it. Okay. So, for example, if they just are picking up purely public content or public domain content that is not under copyright, they then become eligible.
Yes.
Okay. What about the JCP in Australia? Andrea?
So your scenario that you paint there isn't as hypothetical as you think it might be. This is one of the things that I think will be reviewed at the moment by the Treasury of the current action of the News Media Bargaining Code, because the definition of what a news outlet is and what core news content is very vague and not well defined. And if we look at the 28 organisations that have applied for registration with the regulator, ACMA, to declare that they are eligible to start the negotiation process with the big tech companies, there are some fairly dubious looking outlets there that are not that far from the scenario that you paint. So there's room for some improvement, I think, to the way the news organisations are defined, way core content's defined. There's no provision at the moment in the way that news media's companies are registered that they need to provide original content, and indeed entertainment content comes under that remit of what is considered core news provision.
Oh, Andrea, can I weigh in too, just about how this would work in the U.S.?
Hal, please, go ahead.
Yep.
Yeah, I'll be quick. So there are exclusions as to who can participate, who's protected in the JCPA up front. I don't have them all memorized, but it's very likely that the Piracy News Organization that you've hypothesized would be excluded up front. They could also be excluded by the coalition. Now, there's certain non-discrimination provisions that are imposed on the coalitions, but I don't think that, but that relates to the type of content that they, right? I don't think that they would be barred from excluding someone who is a pure pirate. But finally, let's suppose that someone just, for hypotheticals, makes it through the two exclusions that I mentioned, and they make it into the coalition, and the coalition is able to hires a very charming economist, and he or she is able to prevail on the arbitrator that the platforms owe X billion dollars a year, and then we go to the allocation phase. Remember, Congress has compelled in the new version that 65% of the proceeds be allocated on a pro rata basis according to each content provider's share of a journalist under its employ. So I don't know what you wanted to assume about Piracy News, but I'm going to assume, to fill out the hypothetical, that they employ no one. They employ no journalists, in which case, they would be getting 0% of that pot of money. They might be good at getting clicks, in which case they could participate in the remaining 35% of the proceeds. But I think that this would not be a way for enrichment of an organization that didn't have a significant footprint in the employment of journalists.
Oh, I was going going to say there's also some definitional provisions in the bill that how to define an eligible a qualified publication. So part of the definition is that they have an editorial process, that they have like 25% of their content is news. So there's also a definition component to that.
Okay. But that doesn't piggyback on copyright or?
Not really. I mean, I kind of think of like a weird analogy talking about retransmission. And so again, when I worked on Univision, we found out, I worked at the New York station, we found out that our station was being rebroadcast in different parts of the country. And then National Association of Broadcasters wanted to know what percentage of the program you aired did you produce yourself? Because then you're entitled to some revenue, but not for stuff that, to the copyrighted material you don't actually own. And it turned out their sample week was September 11th, 2001. So like 100% of the content was locally produced, so I guess we got more than we would have otherwise. But yeah, so that's how you do it in that
Okay,
case.
I guess I have 35 more seconds for any audience questions. Okay, all right, no one's taking me up on that offer, so please join me in thanking our panelists.